Very happy to be here today. We start, as always, with acknowledging that San Francisco State University sits on stolen indigenous Ohlone people's land, and we always remind ourselves of this acknowledgement. I turn it over now to my colleagues, my comrades, my sister and brother, Gail Walker and Sam Anderson, who are co-moderating, because we start with the acknowledgement first. Then we will come to why we're here, what we are doing, and so on. So Gail, to you.
Good morning, afternoon, evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And yes, I think that there are so many different entities, organizations, individuals that we can lift up and acknowledge. But grateful to the university, grateful to you, Dr. Abdulhani, and our comrades who are joining us from the university to make this very important conversation happen and to be a part of it. And of course, my dear brother Sam Anderson, who has been such an instrumental role in helping to have this conversation about this important piece of history. In terms of acknowledgement, I think that there are so many that we can and need to acknowledge who we've lost over the periods of time, but we're grateful for those who have stepped forward, who have been really key allies and activists in the fight for a free Palestine, and grateful to be a part of this tremendous conversation. I'll pass it now to my brother Sam Anderson and continue to join in the conversation. Sam.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to the world. We like to start off honoring those, as mentioned, who passed on, those activists that have passed on over the past 50 years, who have played instrumental roles in forging solidarity between people of African descent and Palestine, and particularly those in the United States. And I just like to pay tribute to the late Bill Epton and the late Lucius Walker, Gail's father, yes. Reverend Lucius Walker. There are a host of others, Queen Mother Moore, there's another, Elambe Brath, there's another, Kwame Ture, there's another. We have a number of sisters and brothers who, Gwen Patton Woods is another who we could invoke. I think it's extremely important that we honor those people, and that the younger forces in the world understand that they are continuing a very powerful revolutionary legacy when they stand with Palestine, or when they stand with Black America, or when they stand with Black people in the diaspora in general. And so hopefully this afternoon, this morning, this evening, you'll be able to see or hear those important historical elements that led up to the creation of this statement, and also how we can follow through in the 21st century to consolidate and make that bond between Black America and Palestine particularly solid, more solid than ever before in these crazy ass times.
Thank you, Sam. Any of our esteemed guests would like to make any acknowledgement? And if you don't want to do it now, we can also do it throughout the program as well, because many names are going to come out. But if you want to say something now, please go ahead.
If I can just step in for just a second, Rabab, I wanted to just mention, when you talked about youth, Sam, we have many young people who have been really in solidarity with Palestine, and I think that's very heartening and powerful and important. And of course, there's at least one in particular, a young person, Rachel Corey, that comes to mind as somebody who bravely stood up against the powers, literally, physically putting her life on the line. And she's an example, I think, of that youthful energy and positive power within our young people that would be important to remember also at this time.
So I think this is really appropriate that Gail mentioned Rachel Corrie, because we are actually speaking about the statement in the New York Times of Black leaders on Palestine. Rachel Corrie was not Black. She was a white young student at Evergreen College in the
Yes.
state of Washington, who went to Palestine and stood in front of an Israeli bulldozer in Rafah. The
Yes.
Israeli bulldozer was going to destroy Palestinian people's home, and she stood, and the bulldozer would not budge. She stood as an objector,
Yes.
and the Israeli bulldozer killed her, crushed her. And Rachel Corrie and her family live in the state of Washington. Her university, Evergreen College, continues to think about her, and many people talk about that. And that takes us to the question of also the martyrs who have fallen since the most recent uprising for Black lives, when we're talking about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, many people before, too many names, too many victims, too many sacrifices, as well as many people who have fallen in Palestine. Many people think about Iyad al-Hallaq, who was killed a few days after George Floyd and was also killed by Israeli border police in Jerusalem. And now they are being indicted with very light charges, and there is a lot of protest about that, and maybe we can also come back. But the similarities and the comparative nature of the struggles as well as the oppression come back to us. We start with we also remember today the Palestinian prisoner Maher al-Akhras, who's on his 97th day. It was 96, 99. Yeah, today is 96 or 97th day of hunger strike, and he is in prison, and he's on hunger strike because the Israeli military, which continues to occupy militarily Palestine, is refusing to press any charges against him or let him go. I mean, this is basically, he is being denied due process, and he is withholding, and Palestinians have, I guess, the largest ratio of political prisoners in the world to the size of the population. Of course, the US is the largest incarcerated place of all the world. I'm going to come back to that, but I want to, before we move on, I want to also acknowledge that today is the National Independence Day of Algeria, and Algeria comes up a lot, so I'm going to be saving that until we have the conversation, but we want to acknowledge that this is really a very important day. But I also want to thank the team, people who worked on it. First, I want to thank Salim Eshhade. Salim is a doctoral candidate at University of California, Los Angeles. Actually, he defended his prospectus on September 22nd, just the night before we were censored by Zoom for our September 23rd webinar. He defended his prospectus and went through with flying colors. And then the next day, we were struggling, which we will talk about that because this is part of the struggle, part of the work that we're doing. And Salim is doing his dissertation on the oral history and the struggle of the Generation of Palestinian students at San Francisco State University, through support also from the AMED Studies program, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program. Salim also was an MA student at San Francisco State, also passed his MPA with flying colors, got so many awards, collected so many awards from friends and foes alike, and on his field work and in terms of researching, actually doing the archival work. And maybe we can call upon you to speak a little bit about this, because you mentioned something very interesting to me yesterday, but we'll save that till last. Next, I would like to thank Anais Amer. Anais is a student, one of the leaders of the Student for Justice in Palestine at Wellesley College. And Anais is also the founder and the president of the Arab Women's Association at Wellesley as well. Anais is also excellent student, doing really well in her studies in cinema and media studies and quote unquote Middle East studies. That's the name of the program at Wellesley. And Anais has also been really instrumental in the work that we're doing, has been actually working as a research assistant and a researcher with me since the spring. Salim and I, we go way back, since Salim started his MA at San Francisco State when we met back in 2015, right? And I think in, fall 2015. I also want to thank Sarah Sills, who is not here with us, but Sarah is an active member of the steering committee of Jewish Voice for Peace, New York City, Sarah has been doing all these beautiful graphics for us free of charge. And I have to say that because it's the labor that does not get acknowledged about all the stuff that makes things happen. People see something happen and they say it just happened. But there is a lot of labor. And I think we want to talk about the intellectual labor, the physical labor, the labor of love, the labor of pain, of suffering that brings people together and keep us all going. And Sarah has, and Sarah always, we say, she sent us the flyer, we sent suggestions, then she changes, and we sent it, and then we change the date, and then we change the time. And Sarah continues patiently, lovingly, silently, and actually doing it, which is really, really great. Last but not least, I want to thank National Students for Justice in Palestine and the Eyewitness Palestine for actually hosting this. I'm going to turn it to Salim to speak a little bit about what we are doing and why we're here on this platform, StreamYard, and not on Zoom. And I want to also turn it to Anais to speak about, maybe Anais, you can speak about the co-sponsors first, and then we can go to Salim if that's okay. Go ahead, Anais.
Yeah, sure. So our co-sponsors for this event are the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, Boston, Labor for Palestine, South Africa BDS Coalition, Slamidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, Jews for Palestinian Right of Return, and the Feminist Front. So we thank you all for supporting us and sharing and continuing to help us spread the word about the open classrooms and webinars we've been doing for a while now.
Thank you, Anais. So we're all here using this, not using Zoom, because as Dr. Lahadi made brief mention to, when on September 23rd, when we had the webinar with Leila Khalid, Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube all pulled our event or pulled our video, and we were not able to broadcast to the public that event. So because of the censorship, we have decided to switch platforms. There's also an ongoing campaign for folks to push their institutions, push their universities, push whatever organization they are part of to get out of Zoom and to break the kind of near video conferencing monopoly and hold that Zoom really has during this time of COVID. And to really push towards open source, justice-centered companies that kind of don't engage in this form of bulldozing censorship. I am going to share more information about that in the comment section. It'll be through the form of the petition that we have going that has a lot of the context to this, so that you can read more about it and sign your name on. If you so choose to be part of this movement. I will now turn it back to Dr. Abdul Hadi.
Yes, thank you, Salim. So we wanted to actually begin, we're good on time. We wanted to just lay out what we're going to do today. We're going to finish, we're still doing the introduction, actually, segueing into the event. And then we were going to have a discussion why we're doing this event. We already spoke about the sponsors and so on. We want to talk about why we do open classrooms. Then we're going to hear from our esteemed and amazing panelists about the history, the oral history, narratives, and have a roundtable discussion. We're also going to have plenty of time for questions and answers towards the end, to have a lot of discussion. Actually, I think we're having maybe at least half an hour to do so towards the end. So stay with us. This is very exciting. So before we begin even about the statement itself, we wanted to speak about the three major co-sponsors of the co-organizers of the event. So I'm going to turn it over to Brother Sam Anderson to speak about what is the national education, Black education agenda. Then Sister Gail will talk about why IFCO and what is IFCO and why IFCO is co-sponsoring, and then I'll speak a little bit about AMED. So Sam?
Yes, the National Black Education Agenda, NBEA, came out of struggles around multi-decade struggle around public education and around racism within the public education system in the United States, as well as the struggle for the communities, the Black communities, the Latino communities, to control the public education that their children get. We are in the tradition of community control struggles that occurred in the 1960s in New York City, where grassroots organizations, parents and students and teachers who were in solidarity demanded community control of the public education system. We are also fighting against privatization of public education. Here in the United States, public education is being privatized, and that means that the bulk of the money, the tax dollars that go into public education is being siphoned off by hedge funders who push out these front organizations called school choices, charter schools, whatever, to get the money, and the quality of education is poor. They reinforce the Eurocentric education that is the norm in this country. They, in turn, these privateers, in turn, reinforce that. They also reinforce the notion that students advance in their knowledge base by taking norm reference testing, taking high stakes testing, and instead of creating critical thinking skills, these corporations create testing mills in the public school system. So we fight against that. Our base, the National Black Education Agenda's base, is that parents should take over the schools. Parents should take over the schools in coordination with those teachers who are in support, those administrators who are in support, and of course, the students who are in those schools. We have, in Black America, we have the educational expertise to produce all across this country quality public educational schools. We have that expertise, and what NBEA wants to do is to be that central point where the expertise would be free and flowing to the respective communities where parents want quality education in their public schools. And so this is not a new thing. We're just continuing what had occurred some almost 50 years ago or more within New York City and Philadelphia and Chicago and a number of other major urban centers, where parents began to take over, demand to take over the schools and bring in quality education for Black people. Education for liberation is at the core of our existence, and also education is a human right, is at the core of our existence. So that's who we are in a nutshell.
Stop unmuting massive. Thank you, Sam, Dr. Sam Anderson. I would now turn it to Sister Gail to speak about IFCO and why are you here and what you're doing. And of course, I'm also going again to continue saying blessings to Father Lucius Walker, who transitioned to the other world, who has been an amazing, amazing friend of Palestine. I'm not stealing your thunder. I'm just acknowledging. So back to you.
Thank you. No, I'm not feeling that it's stolen at all. Just want to, give my deep appreciation as the current director of IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization. My appreciation for being a part of this program to mark this very important 50-year anniversary of the historic statement from Black activists and academics about solidarity with Palestine. It was a no-brainer for IFCO to be a part of this important programs, helping to sponsor this. Certainly, as you just mentioned, Dr. Abdul Hadi is my father, the late Reverend Lucius Walker, who was an activist in his own right and wore many different hats, but really at the center of his being and what he represented, and as the founding director of IFCO, was really about the fight for justice, and that's what IFCO has been engaged in for the last 53 years now. It's among our work, the work that has been done on the national, international front, fighting for anything from supporting the enfranchisement of Native Americans, political prisoners, the fight against the Ku Klux Klan, the rights of workers, etc. But among our work has been the support of people of Palestine. As a faith-based organization, we stood up for Palestine as a matter of principle and for our steadfast belief in the rights of the Palestinian people. In fact, our organization lost its tax-exempt status in part due to our support for a project that delivered medical aid to the people of Gaza. So it's just, and that was done intentionally. We said we won't back down, we won't stop the defense of our beleaguered friends, even if it meant risking the loss of our status, which happened. We did regain, but that's just part of why this is important for us, IFCO, be here, to be present, and to be participating. And on a personal level, I just want to say, when I traveled to the region, this is many years ago, I'm long overdue for a return, so I need to have some conversations with you, Dr. Abdul Hadi, about that. But I got an opportunity to visit various parts of the old city in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Ramallah, Jericho, Hebron, and I saw first the brutal injustice and apartheid-like behavior perpetrated against the Palestinians that were forced to endure at the hands of the Israeli powers, unrelenting violations of international law, occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, and the wholesale destruction of homes and the confiscation of lands. And I know we'll be talking about this, but it really had such a powerful impact on me to see, for example, the destruction of the beautiful ancient olive trees that really represent Palestinian resistance and resilience. The utter disrespect for Palestinian elders and youth at checkpoints, and the routine searches of their homes and restrictions on their movement, severely limiting access to housing, decent housing and schools and food, hospitals, water, and so much more. So as people of faith, people of conscience, people committed to justice, it's our honor and our duty to be here and to participate in all efforts to support the rights of the people of Palestine. So that's why IFCO generally, and that's why Gail personally. So thank you.
Thank you for all your support. I know we've met a few years ago, actually through Father Walker, who has always been doing all these caravans to Cuba and Latin America, and there is an event, like a major event at the church many years ago, to actually talk about Palestine and educate people. So it was really about the whole question of engaging people of faith communities into that. And actually we have a few people of faith communities who are joining us that I know personally, so I'm hoping maybe folks will chat. So I wanted to say a little bit why AMED, why this webinar, and by actually just starting by, we always we follow the tradition also known in the US as call and response, but it's an African tradition where somebody calls the other people response. It's also an indigenous tradition, but also tradition in Palestine. Somebody says something, so you don't just move on to what you want to say next without responding responding to the call that your sisters, brothers, your communities, your kinfolk, your everybody who's comrades with you has done. So I wanted to just say, like, today, now is the olive season in Palestine. Now we are actually going to witness, and we see it again and again, both people celebrating life, land, and joy, and picking up the olives, making olive oil, pickling the olives, making soap out of it. but also we see a lot of colonists, Israeli colonists, who are burning the olives. We see them stealing the olives from the Palestinian farmers, and we see the Israeli military actually enabling that, and also restricting the time of when can Palestinians go to their fields to pick up the olive oil and bring it on, and so on. So this is part of the context. There is a lot we can talk about. I wanted to also maybe respond to just one thing that Sam mentioned, which is the whole question of education, that we are at a time when, in addition to the whole privatization of education, which I'm going to actually pass it on to Salim to speak about in terms of the webinar, we also have been targeted, particularly, and I say we, I'm talking about people who are focusing their work, scholarship, teaching, and advocacy around questions for justice in for Palestine as part of the indivisibility of justice. And we have been targeted specifically by pro-Israel Zionist groups who are trying to accomplish a number of things. One is to actually say that Palestinian education is a terrorist education in order to criminalize all Palestinian education, and also in terms of actually undermining the just demands of the Palestinian educators, students, people at their universities, at schools, and so on, to have the right to learn, right to education. And so Israel has been actually very much involved in undermining Palestinian education. This is not new. During the Aqsa Intifada, when Israel re-invaded Palestinian cities in 2001, 2002, they actually destroyed almost 1 million or about 1 million of high school diplomas of Palestinian students. Nobody understands what does this have to do, even if they're talking about the whole question of national security and so on. What does this have to do with it? Unless the definition of Israeli national security has to do with erasure of the Palestinian people. Here in the United States, there has been, and this has been an amazing victory when people think, I mean, this is what Sam talked about in terms of education, in terms of the things that we are accomplishing. Gail is talking about getting the tax-exempt status for IFCO back, which is a huge victory. And sometimes people get so much immersed or so much beaten up and brutalized by the viciousness of people who are trying to put us down, that sometimes we forget about these victories. But also there was the Trump administration appointed a man named Kenneth Marcus, who is one of the leading pro-Israel people in the United States. He established a center called Brandeis Center for Human Rights. So the Trump administration appointed him to be the head of civil rights in the Department of Education. We know who's running the Department of Education, Betty DeVos and her connections and so on. But he was appointed. There was a lot of protests against him by multiple civil rights groups saying that he's not going to be able to do the job. But he got appointed anyway. And when Kenneth Marcus was in office, he actually went after all Palestinian universities, Palestinian activists and advocates, and so on. For example, one of the first things he took up was to attack Rutgers University, which the Zionists have already claimed that Rutgers University creates an uncomfortable climate for Jewish students, and thus it is anti-Semitic. And the Department of Education, the previous department, had actually investigated and said there is nothing. This is warrantless. This is foundless. But Kenneth Marcus was vindictive, vicious, so he went after Rutgers again, went after many universities, and actually neglected what he is supposed to do to investigate other charges of civil violations and so on in many schools, and also, of course, facilitated the agenda of the Department of Education to basically around the whole question of everything, around question of privatization, around question of charter school, around question of how sexual harassment on campus, around questions of gender liberty, sexual justice, and so on. He was always with all of that agenda, but he basically focused to target Palestinian activists and Palestine activists, and civil liberties group led by a group called Palestine Legal actually signed statements, Center for Constitutional Rights, many statements signed, American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee and so on, signed the statement and then he was forced to resign at the end of July, which was a huge important achievement. So I think it's really important to think about that. But this is what's going on with filing multiple Zionist organizations, from the Stand With Us to Zahor to the Lawfare project and so on. they filed multiple complaints to the Department of Education against students and universities, specifically targeting them on the question of Palestine. I'll leave it. And then they also went after many groups around the whole question of tax exempt. So they targeted American Association of University Professors. Now they're targeting. They're actually pressuring San Francisco State, saying you may lose all your funding if you actually continue to maybe house me and house the program that we have, and so on. So we're actually receiving a lot of pressure from the university, which we'll speak about that later on. But I didn't want to spend a lot of time also around the whole question of the attacks against us. But this is one of the things that we share. But one of the reasons we're doing this is because this is part of our open classroom. Open classrooms, we open our classrooms to the public. AMED Studies believes that we are reflecting and translating what we call the spirit of '68, the students who went on a strike, longest strike in the history of the United States at our university, led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front. They demanded the College for Third World Studies, they demanded open admission, they demanded that students, specifically Black students, indigenous students, other students of color, get into the university. They demanded that they have faculty who can teach them, who can understand what they're going through, who are from their communities, who validate the experiences of community knowledge. And the students at the end of the strike, they won many of their demands. The university gave them a College of Ethnic Studies instead of the College for Third World Studies. But what we really want to talk about here is that this is something in AMED that we do, is bring the community with the university together, have the university being accountable to the community. So we don't do any of our classrooms, we don't do any of our webinars, bringing people who are working in the university, only scholars in the university. We actually bring together what we call public intellectuals, because people don't have to have a degree in order for them to be able to speak. They're actively engaged and they affect history. So we want to be able to do that. We also want to instill in among our students the sense that you cannot do your knowledge, you cannot produce your knowledge outside of accountability to the community, especially the knowledge that you're building out of the community experiences. So that's another aspect of it. Also, we believe that we are with our responsibility to produce knowledge. That's what we do. So we insist on producing knowledge for justice, and we insist in making that knowledge available to also our communities. I mean, this is our jobs. We get paid to do this. So we might as well do that, not only produce our knowledge in ivory towers and little cubicles away from everybody else, where the knowledge doesn't really change the world, doesn't affect social change, but it ends up being a competitive grounds between other academics themselves and so on. And we're not really interested in that. We're not interested in reinforcing individualism. We are interested in actually working for a different world and playing our world in that. So this is what we do in AMED. And for this particular today and other webinars we've done, we're very much interested in commemorating occasions that basically gives us the opportunity for us to talk about what happened in the past, because not everybody knows what happened. And we know that the goal of education, and which it's a very contested ground, we're all fighting over it, is to make people forget histories of the struggle and to make people learn a very oppressive and repressive history. And this is part of also the Zionist attacks that are going today, that are actually criticizing critical ethnic studies. Even Trump signed an executive order about that. And this is battle that's going on in the schools of California, so we can talk about that. Actually, it would be really important to talk about it, because they're targeting even the bill that was passed in California called AB 1460 around ethnic studies. So basically, the Zionists and the right-wing white supremacists actually seem to have the same agenda. They collaborate with each other, and they basically would like to silence this. So we're saying, actually, no, this is our job as scholars. This is our job as researchers. This is our job as public intellectuals, to bring these communities together, to actually learn about episodes in our history, to be able to bring them forward and to understand what happened. And this is the goal of actually having this conversation today, to commemorate that incredible historic statement that was published 50 years ago in the New York Times today, that was led by Black leaders, and that basically contested the dominant US view, Zionist and dominant mainstream Anglo-white supremacist US view of history and of the region as one that is supporting of Israel. And actually the statement came out and contested it. So we think it's really, really important to commemorate. We really need to think about narratives of resistance, narratives of oppression, as well as narrative of resistance. So in September, we commemorated the Sabra and Shatila massacre against Palestinians in Lebanon. And we continue to do that because this is really important for us to also learn about the historic moment that have passed, about the people, oral history that they can share with us. And this is why we have, and really produce knowledge in a way that we're all co-learning in a pedagogical manner where we come together and learn with each other. And I just wanted to say one more thing before we pass to the next point, is that both Sam Anderson and Gail Walker, as well as a member of the board of IFCO, Dr. Rosemary Mealy, are all also involved in building solidarity with Cuba, which actually has an excellent education system, and it has a medical school. And I know you had meetings yesterday, Gail, and I've attended IFCO dinners where there were graduate students from medical school were being celebrated. And also we know that Cuba has sent a lot of people also to help out with the COVID-19 around the world without expectation of paying back and so on. So I think it's also really important for us to think about what kind of education we want and how do we educate and how do we. So this is also kind of like there is so many connections at so many levels that we are thinking about, and we need to actually, and this also contestation of the privatization of education.
Yeah, and I just want to also say that there are many students from Palestine that are studying at the Latin America School of Medicine under full scholarship.
So yeah, I think a bit, maybe 100 scholarships or something.
Yeah, there's something along that. But I've had an opportunity to speak to some of those students as well, which is, you're right, we're all interconnected. So
yes, and Cuba has been amazingly supportive of Palestine and so on. So I would like to actually, Salim, I wanted to pass it back on to you because you wanted to talk about what happened with our previous webinar before we move on to this conversation. Then we can make the connections.
No, I think let's circle back to that. I did make brief mention. Yeah, I did make brief mention of it earlier. I did know though that Dr. Sam Anderson did want to open up the space with the reading of the document. So I think that
that was the next. That was the next point.
Okay.
Yes, I've forgotten. But I heard you saying you wanted to say something, so I've passed it on to you. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to have Dr. Anderson actually has volunteered to read the statement. The statement is an appeal by Black Americans against United States support for the Zionist government of Israel. Very well chosen words. So Sam is going to read the statement. Then we are going to actually have kind of like speak about who was in it. And then we are going to open it up to the people who are here, who've signed the statement, to talk about oral history. Why did you sign the statement? How did you come about? What happened with it? So first we read the statement, and then we're going to talk about how did it come about? What's the ethnography about it? What really exactly happened? And then we're going to open it up for discussion for the content of the statement, as well as what does it mean for today. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yes, as one of the organizers and signatures of this statement, I will read it. It's dated, it's titled An Appeal by Black Americans Against United States Support for the Zionist Government of Israel, November 1st, 1970. It's a New York Times advertisement by the Committee of Black Americans for Truth about the Middle East. We, the Black American signatories of this advertisement, are in complete solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters who, like us, are struggling for self-determination and an end to racist oppression. The recent bloodbath in Jordan, resulting in tens of thousands of dead and wounded Palestinians, would not have been possible without the encouragement, armaments, and financial aid of the United States government. America's support for King Hussein's slaughter of Palestinian refugees and freedom fighters is consistent with its support of reactionary dictatorships throughout the world, from Cambodia and Vietnam to South Africa, Greece, and Iran. We stand with the Palestinian people in their efforts to preserve their revolution and oppose its attempted destruction by American imperialism aided by Zionists and Arab reactionaries. We state that we are not anti-Jewish. We are anti-Zionist and against the Zionist state of Israel, the outpost of American imperialism in the Middle East. Zionism is a reactionary, racist ideology that justifies the expulsion of the Palestinian people from their homes and lands, and attempts to enlist the Jewish masses of Israel and elsewhere in the service of imperialism to hold back the Middle East revolution. The Zionist Organization of America, in an ad in the New York Times of September 17th, 1970, stated, "It is appropriate for the United States to begin to treat Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, as a de facto ally for safeguarding of American interest," unquote. According to the National Observer on May 18th, 1970, the World Zionist Movement is big business. Quote, "When the blood flows, the money flows," observes Gottlieb Hammer, chief Zionist fund collector in this country. We state that the Palestinian Revolution is the vanguard of the Arab Revolution and is part of the anti-colonial revolution, which is going on in places such as Vietnam, Mozambique, Angola, Brazil, Laos, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Because of its alliance with imperialism, Zionism opposes that anti-colonial revolution and especially revolutionary change in the Middle East. We state that Israel, Rhodesia, and South Africa are three privileged white settler states that came into existence by displacing indigenous peoples from their lands. Israel and South Africa each have about 4,500 political prisoners, most of whom have not been brought to trial. Jay Weitz, director of the Department of Colonization of Jewish Agency for Israel, stated, quote, "The only possible solution lies in creating a Palestine without Arabs. And there is no other way to do this than to transfer all the Arabs to neighboring countries, to move all of them out of here," unquote. That's in Davar, published in Israel, September 29th, 1967. The South African government supported Israel during the June 1967 war. Dr. Vorster's government not only permitted South African volunteers to work in civilian and paramilitary capacities in Israel, but more than $28 million was raised by pro-apartheid South African Zionists and sent to Israel. After the June 1967 Middle East War, there was a considerable speculation about an Israel-type action against Zambia and Tanzania, countries which share a firm anti-apartheid policy and support the African liberation movement. In September 1967, South Africa's top army and Air Force officers learned at firsthand about Israel's tactics in the Middle East War from General Mordecai Hard, commander of the Israeli Air Force. He addressed between 50 and 100 officers at the Air Force College, Vuterkerkagel. That was a quote out of the Johannesburg Sunday Express, September 10th, 1967. We state that Israel continues to support United States policies of aggression in Southeast Asia, policies that are responsible for the death and wounding of thousands of Black youths. The New York Times of November 9th, 1969, stated that Jacques Torgersteiner, head of the Zionist Organization of America, quote, appealed to American Jews to support Nixon's Vietnam policies. Mr. Tucker Ziner, who recently returned last week from Israel, said that people there are in accord with President Nixon's Vietnam policies, unquote. The November 17th, 1969 New York Times stated that, quote, administrative sources, November 16th, released a message from Israeli Premier Golda Meir calling President Nixon's November 3rd Vietnam speech meaningful, quote unquote. It contained, she said, in a personal message to Mr. Nixon, congratulating him on the speech, it contained much that encourages and strengthens freedom-loving small nations, unquote. We state that the exploitation experienced by Afro-Americans, Native Americans, i.e. Indians, Puerto Ricans, and Chicanos, i.e. Mexican Americans, is similar to the exploitation of Palestinian Arabs and Oriental Jews by the Zionist State of Israel. Meir Yari, General Secretary of the left Zionist MAPAM, United Workers' Party, at the party's fourth Congress in 1963 said, quote, this social exploitation helps hold the Oriental communities, one half of the population, in their state of economic, social, and cultural discrimination. The common denominator of the two problems is that the Arab workers must live in a hut or hovel on the outskirts of the Jewish towns, and the worker of the Sephardic community is packed into a crowded slum, unquote. We state that despite the ultra-nationalist policies of the State of Israel's progressive programs of the Palestinian liberation movements are popularly supported by most Arab nations. In January 1969, Fatah spokesman Yasser Arafat stated, quote, our political vision for a free Palestine is a democratic, secular, non-racial state where all Palestinians, Christians, Jews, and Muslims will have equal rights, unquote. The Democratic Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine presented the following in a resolution introduced to the Palestine National Congress in 1969. Quote, the Palestine National Congress will struggle for a popular democratic Palestinian state where Arabs and Jews enjoy equal rights without discrimination, where all forms of national and class oppression shall be abolished, unquote. We state that the opposition of policies of Zionism all exist within Israel and among world Jewry. The following are excerpts from a thesis submitted for discussion to the Israeli Socialist Organization in 1966. Quote, Israel will be de-Zionized, i.e. all present laws and practices discriminating between Jews and non-Jews implementing Jewish supremacy will be abolished. Israel will adopt an anti-imperialist foreign policy, actively supporting the forces struggling for socialism and unification in the Arab world, unquote. We state that Israel supported the United States in the Korean War, aided France and the terrorist secret army organization in Algeria against the Algerian Revolution, opposed anti-colonial independence movements in Morocco, Tunisia, Indonesia, and elsewhere, trained the counter-revolutionary paracommandos of General Mobutu, who was one of the persons responsible for the murder of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and presently provides arms and other equipment to the Portuguese troops fighting against the Angolan and Mozambican freedom fighters. We demand that all military aid or assistance of any kind to Israel must stop. Imperialism and Zionism must and will get out of the Middle East. We call for Afro-American solidarity with Palestinian people's struggle for national liberation and to regain all of their stolen land. So that
Uh,
statement?
that was amazing. And that is, of course, sponsored by the Committee for Black Americans against against United States support for the Zionist government of Israel. So we're going to have a discussion about the content of the statement. We're going to have a discussion with the people who actually signed it to talk about it. But I was wondering if I may, just to before I turn it over to my sister Gail to introduce our some of our speakers, I just wanted to say I went through it and I wrote, if you don't mind, some of the names. There were 56 people who signed it. 15 of them were women. One of the discussion questions is why 56? Why not more? Why not less? What was happening? Who are the names who could be in it that were missing? What's that? But I wanted to mention the people who are in it that will bring immediate recognition, in addition to our esteemed participants here. Grace and James Lee Boggs from New York, from Detroit. Les Campbell, who was of the East, a cultural organization at El Puente. He was a black teacher in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. He was targeted by Al Shanker, who targeted the parents, which refers to what Sam was talking about, of Ocean Hill, Brownsville battle, and actually printed 500,000 flyers that were anti-Semitic and distributed them as if they were actually from the Black and Puerto Rican neighbors of Ocean Hill, Brownsville. There is a new film documentary that's made by a couple of people who talk about this, who discuss it. One Black, one Jewish, actually. The next person is Dolores Cayo, and for me, that's actually makes me so excited because I really didn't know until I looked at it. Because in last spring, we attended a celebration of Dolores Cayo at San Francisco State, organized by one of my colleagues, Mark Davis, and who is the head of the Racial Justice Council at San Francisco State in the faculty union. And then I found her name, and she was the secretary of the Black Faculty Union at San Francisco State College at the time. And she is the founder of the dance program. And the honoring my colleagues did was because Dolores Cayo was not actually recognized, but she had an amazing role all over Africa, teaching kids how to dance and engaging in San Francisco and so on. So it's really great. Another person is Reverend Albert Cleage, I think. And he was from the Shrine of the Black Madonna. He hosted Malcolm X. When Malcolm X gave the speech, the ballot or the bullet. I mean, this is incredible. Ella Collins, the sister of Malcolm X, and also from the Organization of African Unity. And she was actually like a mother to him. If you watch her interviews and so on, she was more like a mother to him than just a sister. She was an older sister. Florence Kennedy, Flo Kennedy. Flo Kennedy was a leader of the Black feminist movement. She was a prominent lawyer. She passed away a couple of years ago, and she was actually very much involved with the Kitchen Table Women of Color press, along with Barbara Smith, who edited, all these famous books and so on. All the women are Black, all the men are white, but some of us are Black and so on. I mean, it's really incredible. And then there is Leonard Conrad Lynn, who was a prominent lawyer who actually defended Lolita Lebron in New York. And there was also Robert Williams and his partner, who he defended actually, and he defended Robert Williams. He defended H. Brown as well. So you're talking about somebody who's, and then you're talking about Earl Ofari, writer, Afro-American Cultural Association from New York, William Petrie, Third World Solidarity Committee with Vietnam from Chicago, B.R. Washington, who was a rank and file caucus member of the Transport Workers Union in New York City, and of course Robert F. Williams, who was a mentor to the Black Panther Party, the author of Negroes with Guns in Detroit, and Maxine Williams, his partner, and also Gwendolyn Patton Weeds, who was co-chair and former national coordinator for the National Association of Black Students in Washington, D.C. And these are just the people that I was kind of like able to research and recognize. But I think this statement is a topic for a PhD dissertation. So I think we want to, to me, it's really, really exciting. It's exciting to have all this, but it's also a question of kind of like, where were other people? How did this statement come about? A lot of the time we know we look at a statement like, now I know why this Palestinian statement was signed by those folks, but not signed by other folks. And sometimes I think of it as a network analysis. I mean, especially if it's not published alphabetically, if it's published who signed first and so on, I'm like, aha, this is what happened. This is what the connection is going on and so on. So this is some of this statement. Unfortunately, it's mentioned, but it's not really analyzed. And I think the content of it is really incredible. So if we can actually maybe go now, and if you don't mind, my sister Gail, if you want to kind of like, start with Phil Hutchins, Robert Lerob, and Sam Anderson to speak about that. And then we'll say a few words about Fran Beal. And she, unfortunately is in the hospital. She just got admitted. She's ill, but she actually did speak to us. So we have some of the comments we can share, and we can also get her on another time. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Gail, to introduce our comments here, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Very good. Great. Thank you. That I've learned a lot. And thank you, Sam, for sharing that document. I think it's, as you just mentioned, Rabab, it's such a historically rich, an amazing statement written in 1970, but yet not really surprising given the radical climate, especially in the country, especially within the Black and Brown communities. But what a powerful statement. So thank you for that. We are just honored to have several of the signers of the document with us. We're going to start out with Phil Hutchins, who was born in 1942 in Cleveland, Ohio, attended Howard University, and worked in education and nonprofit management. He was a civil rights activist, continues to be, and a member, I believe, the chair of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Newark, Jersey, and one of the signers of the document. So we're going to ask Phil Hutchins to join us.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to say that it was really great hearing Sam read the statement. I hadn't heard it or read it in quite a few years, and it was. I mean, it's remarkable hearing that and thinking about the many people who signed it and people who and the struggles that they came out of. And I had been a member of SNCC, and I think what brought me to it was learning in SNCC, working with grassroots people and in the South, and dealing with state violence, which was basically through the state legislatures, police forces, and different juries, and just daily life under what was called Jim Crow segregation, what poor oppressed people go through. And I think I say that because it encompasses a lot of the people who I knew in SNCC, who, when we heard about Palestine or other struggles around the world, is that we began to understand it more than simply a document. We understood what were some of the struggles that people were going through, what was the mass struggle, and it was our growing awareness. I mean, we started out as a group working in the U.S. South, pretty much geared around the political struggles of the United States, the Southern United States. And increasingly, we had growing awareness of things outside the United States, which had impact on people everywhere, and particularly poor and oppressed people everywhere. So as some of our people went to Africa and Southern Africa, West Africa, to learn about the growing independent struggles, that we began to get a sense of internationalism. And SNCC had an international affairs office in New York City, which was led by the late Jim Foreman, and who was one of the key people in pushing us to have an international consciousness. And that's what was the basis of having a real revolutionary consciousness, not just for your own people, not just for your own struggle, but basically how these struggles mix, and very frequently had the same opponents, working behind the scenes or more directly against people rising up to get their own rights and for national sovereignty of different nations. So I guess for me personally, and this is where I will bring in Algeria, I think that I became aware of the Arab world as a high school student, and in Cleveland, Ohio, and dealing with liberal people, Jews and other folks who basically were on this question not so liberal. I mean, they were liberal, and I saw this even more when I lived in New York, is that you had people who were very liberal on most issues of the day and dealing in U.S. politics, but somehow they basically raised the question of Israel, and attaching that as part of trying to make that part of the agenda. So it's through that growing awareness and trips to Africa, trips to Cuba, and going through the struggle of the 70s, which I think really has to think of the role that many of us played in the anti-war movement against the U.S. war in Vietnam, which in many ways was the key international struggle of the 1970s. Vietnam will win, and fighting to make that happen, and the role of Vietnam having a major political impact on us. And when I first went to Cuba in 1970, Vietnam was talking about Vietnam and the role that Vietnam was playing internationally against U.S. imperialism, and the struggle for peoples in Africa, Asia, other parts of Latin America became a sense of how people could unite. And we needed statements, documents, physical presentations of solidarity with people, because in the United States, the mainstream press was not going to give us that type of understanding or even recognition. So he said, in many ways, the context for the statement comes for me out of that, and trying to demystify both the role of so-called U.S. democracy, and realizing it once you experience people who lived under governments which had received, quote, aid or support from the U.S. or attacks by the U.S. military, that the U.S. was not so democratic, and so that we had to broaden the thrust of our struggle in beyond the South of the United States, and to basically deal with what was happening internationally, and that's continued. And I find it great that looking at that now, 50 years later or more, is that we're still struggling here in the United States, African Americans. This year, particularly 2020, was a major year of Black struggle all over the country, and we feel that we brought in more allies, but we also increased our support among other peoples of color in the United States and internationally, and that has continued. And at the same time, 50 years later, we see our brothers and sisters in Palestine still suffering, still fighting, still struggling. And it's really great when the struggles can come together and support each other. I mean, I remember back during the time of Occupy Oakland in an earlier part of this century, when we were struggling and we saw that the Palestinians in Gaza had raised a banner saying Occupy Oakland, supporting Occupy Oakland. And to me, that was a great symbol of Palestinians supporting what we were doing in the United States. And that happened again in other places around Gaza, the struggle in Gaza, where North American and particularly African American activists and organizations supported the thrust of what was happening in Gaza for the right of people in Palestine to be sovereign and independent. And we felt that was what we were supposed to be doing. It wasn't like it was any effort to do that. It was basically an accentuation of our politics, which was basically our lived politics in the struggle. And we basically support the fact that the Palestinians are continuing to struggle, and we could continue to struggle with them. And I would just say, personally, as somebody who feels I'm part of what gets so called sometimes the Black radical tradition in the United States, that it's the goal to support all these struggles that are fighting against imperialism, colonialism, and external domination, and that we will, we will have each other's back in the struggle, and that as the Palestinians struggle in their struggle and our struggle, but they will come together, and we have a great role and responsibility in fighting, and basically fighting the Zionist movement in the United States, which basically has tries to find ways to divide and conquer progressive movements, divide and conquer the Black movement, and keep Blacks and Palestinians from working together. And we pledge ourselves to do that and continue that struggle. And we believe that in the long run, like Vietnam, Palestine will win. And it's our role to make that happen. And I think it's really important that people in Palestine know that there are African Americans and a widening group of people who basically see their responsibility in the United States to keep the struggle of Palestine visible, active, and making as many possible alliances between the Black and the Palestinian community in the United States as possible, and struggle to the final end of Palestinian Palestinian independence and sovereignty. And I want to thank you for giving me the chance to do that, say this, and that I think the statement that Sam read and that time period of 1970 was really a key point, and I keep thinking of ways that we need to keep the light shining on Palestine, and also building alliances, which is what I've been doing with SNCC and other groups most of my political life. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Phil. I know we have tons of questions for you, because we also know a lot of stuff about your oral history, so we will come back to that. And we're also going to be showing some of the images of what SNCC statement was, the one that you published and so on. But I'm going to pass it over to Gail to also continue to maybe we can share those in the pictures. Maybe you want to, maybe we can go back to Ambassador Robert next. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Oops. Sorry. I am okay. I've unmuted myself. Yeah, very again, rich history, and I look forward to some of the images that we'll be able to pull together shortly. But moving along for now. Next, we're going to hear from another very key person in this movement, Robert F. Lerope, who has a varied and distinguished career, which included, stints as the assistant legal counsel at the NAACP in the late 1960s, as ambassador to the United Nations for the Republic of Vanuatu, as a journalist and film producer, as a founding partner in the law firm of Van Leeuwenhoek, Burns and Bassett at the United Nations during the 1980s. He was influential in negotiating on important global issues, including the ending of apartheid in South Africa and on international environmental law. He was the vice president of the United Nations General Assembly in its 43rd session and chair of the 4th committee, which is the Trusteeship and Decolonization Committee, during the 44th session of the General Assembly, and vice chair of the ad hoc committee of the whole during the 16th special session on the United Nations General Assembly on Apartheid and its destructive consequences in Southern Africa. He's also served as the first chairman of the Alliance of Small Island Nations from 1991 to 1994. So we are very honored to have the ambassador with us. And Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gail.
You're welcome.
Can everyone hear me? Did I do something wrong?
No, you're
We
all
can
right.
we
I
can
hear
hear
you.
You hear me? Okay,
We
good.
see you when we hear you.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Gail, and greetings through you to your late dad, who did a great deal to support many of the pieces of work that I was fortunate to be involved in. Lucius Walker was a giant. He is still a giant, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I'd like to also acknowledge the role of Paul Boutel, who was my. This is really ironic. Paul Boutel's father and my father grew up together in Suriname and were big buddies in the anti-colonial movement in Suriname. And when Paul and I became great friends, he was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, very proud to be a Trotskyite. I never was a Trotskyite, but many people thought I was because of my friendship with Paul Boutel. But a lot of people made a great many mistakes. But Paul was the person who suggested to me that we sign this statement, the Declaration, in September of 1970 that appeared in the New York Times. And Paul was also a person who introduced me to people like George Habash and Naif Hawatmeh and other leaders of the Palestinian resistance. And once, when I was practicing law with the firm Fleischer, Dornbusch, Menchen, Mandelstam, a partner in the law firm, the daughter of a partner in the law firm, was on a TWA flight that was hijacked into the desert in Jordan. And I was asked to bring him there because they wanted to release her. And as a matter of fact, something that a lot of people don't remember is that the Palestinians who hijacked the flight said that they wanted to release Barbara Mensch and that they were going to challenge the US government to release Angela Davis at that time. And of course, the US did not release Angela Davis, but Marty Mensch, her father, and I did travel to Jordan and then to the Palestinian camps. And ironically, the New York Post, who Mr. Trump never refers to as fake news, wrote an article saying that she was my girlfriend and that I went with her father to negotiate her release. First of all, she was a small child. I had never met her, but she was 16 years old at the time. So I don't think that she would have ever had a boyfriend of my age at that time. But Barbara, when she was released, told stories of how the hijackers had risked their lives to make sure that there was a rabbi who was also on the flight, that he had kosher food. He wanted kosher food. And in fact, one or two of them were actually killed by the Jordanian military because they went out searching for kosher food for her. And that's another bit of humanitarianism that has never been discussed. The Palestinians were always very, very humanitarian, very focused on the struggle, and always full of solidarity with other oppressed people. So this signing the statement in September of 1970, that was an easy decision to make. As a matter of fact, if asked why we signed it, our response was, why wouldn't we? And why would others not sign it? Um, Sam Anderson, I've known for a good many years, since he was one of the four leaders who seized the office, occupied the office of the president of Columbia University in support of progressive causes. Sam Anderson, Bill Sales, Andy Newman, Cicero Wilson. Those were the four members of the steering committee for those student activists who continued to be activists after the occupation of Columbia was ended. Did I get that right, Sam?
I was an outsider. I was not a student at I was not a student at Columbia. I was one of the quote unquote community folk. So I was the outsider. So formally,
Sam, you have never been an outsider. You might have been called an outside agitator, but you were never an outsider. You may not have been enrolled at Columbia University, but there's no way that Sam Anderson was ever an outsider. And I know
Amen.
that,
Amen.
I don't know about Cicero and Andy. I don't know where they are now, but I know that if Bill Sales were here, he would be shocked and he would say, outsider, Sam Anderson? No way, no way.
I'm sorry to just interrupt for a minute, Ambassador. It's also the same story with San Francisco State. So San Francisco State, it was students, Black Student Union, Third World Liberation Front, that led the strike. But one of the members of the delegation, the U.S. Prisoner Solidarity Delegation, the first one we did in 2016 was Hank Jones. And Hank was telling us actually in Palestine afterwards that he went from the South, right, to San Francisco, and he was one of the community organizers. So when you talk about Sam Anderson, quote unquote insider, that's the way Hank would say, oh, I wasn't actually a student at San Francisco State. But then when you talk to all the strikers, and when there was the 50th anniversary of that Black Panther Party, and we were meeting with everybody was, whatever he says, everybody listens to, because he was one of the organizers, one of the leaders. So there is always this kind of relationship between university and community that I'm really, really grateful that I'm sorry for the interruption.
And I'm glad that Sam brought us together. And Sam, finally, I'll tell you that the only outsider I know of is named Mr. Trump. And he is definitely an outside agitator. You're an unenrolled brother, but not an outsider, not at all. Unenrolled at Columbia at that time. But anyway, Paul Boutel said that we should really get on board and sign and support this statement. And we did. And when I went with Marty Mensch to get his daughter released, there was no negotiation. I didn't have to negotiate anything. They said they wanted to do that, to release her in solidarity with the Black people in this country. And that was when they issued the challenge to the United States to release Angela Davis at the same time. And we knew that the US was not about to release Angela Davis at that time. So I could not be prouder than to have signed that statement and to be a longtime supporter of the Palestinian resistance. And resistance is exactly what it is, because the way the Palestinian people have been treated, the way their land was stolen, the way their culture was suppressed, or attempted to be suppressed, and the way that they always stood tall with oppressed people in other parts of the world. And another piece of serendipity was that when I was getting ready to go to Mozambique to make the documentary on the independence movement in Mozambique, Verda May Grosvenor, you remember her? Verda May Grosvenor introduced me to Bob Fletcher because I had said to Verda May I needed to find a good camera person, someone who had experience with this kind of thing. And of course, there was no one who had experience with this kind of thing, but she referred me to Bob Fletcher, who was a SNCC photographer. And Bob used to always tell me stories about how, when working in the South, he used to carry his cameras over his shoulder. And when they had encounters with the Proud Boys of that day, that Bob would take his cameras off of his shoulder and swing them as weapons of self-defense. And I said to myself, "Oh boy, this guy has got to come with me. I've got to have him." And Bob is today a lawyer in Florida, and we still are in touch. We're still good friends. We made 2 films in Mozambique on the revolution, and Lucius Walker was one of our big supporters of those films, and it's just so amazing. I'm sorry that Paul Boutel is no longer with us, but his spirit lingers, and many people in Palestine knew Paul and still love and respect him. I should probably end now because other people might have more to add and contribute to this. My role was really relatively small, but my heart has always been with the people of Palestine and always will be with the people of Palestine, always. Thank you. Thawra Hatanasser.
Your Arabic is really good.
Shukran.
We'll come back. We'll come back because this is very interesting about the hijacking, especially since the censoring of our webinar. But we'll come back to
Yeah.
that. Maybe
And
Gail, yeah.
believe me,
You wanna
that story that I was
yeah.
going to get my quote unquote girlfriend that appeared in the New York Post, that didn't go down too well with my girlfriend at the time,
not,
who never even knew where I went because I just disappeared one Friday, and she never knew where I was until we returned maybe 3 or 4 weeks later.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Well,
Well,
we're gonna have a lot of questions for you as well, but we want to also hear from Sam next. So
Okay.
back to you, Gail.
yes, again, important reason, Dr. Abdul Hadi, to have this open classroom. I mean, we're all learning so much. I know I'm just so pleased to be here. So thank you so much, Ambassador. Next, we want to hear from our dear friend, Sam Anderson. Dr. Sam Anderson is from Brooklyn, New York. He's a native and founding member of the Coalition for Public Education and the National Black Education Agenda. He's the author of several books and essays on science, technology, and the history of slavery. Among them, The Third World Confronts Science and Technology and The Black Holocaust for Beginners. Excellent read. He is an editor at Black Dialogue, Noble Journal, and the Black Activist. He was the first chair of the Black Studies Department from 1969 to 1970 at Sarah Lawrence College and taught mathematics, science, and Black history at SUNY Old Westbury City College of New York, New York University, Rutgers University, and Brooklyn College. He has been active in the civil rights and Black liberation movement since 1964. As a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the Black Panther Party, and the Black Reparations Movement. And you can find many of his writings at blackeducator.org. Sam Anderson, we're pleased to have you, and you now have the floor.
Thank you. And a good evening, afternoon, morning again to everybody who's listening. We hope to get people engaged in some questions and so forth. It's very, very important that we carry on the legacy of struggle from what was going on 50 years ago. The context in which we organized this letter, not letter, but statement, was coming out of a period of 1969, 1970, 1968, 1969, 1970, which were very, very tumultuous times. Every day there was something going on in terms of actions in any part of the world. And the Black liberation movement was ascending, I would say, in this period. This period showed a burst of demand for Black studies programs all across the country. And they became intellectual centers fairly quickly. San Francisco State was one. There were a couple others in other places. And by 1969, students at Sarah Lawrence College demanded a Black Studies program, and I subsequently was hired as the chair of the program and also teaching a math course while doing the chair work. And the context is that Sarah Lawrence was and is a very liberal college, but when it came to the issue of Zionism, it was liberalism went out the window. My signing on to the statement meant that I subsequently, make a long story short, my job was relegated to one day. And the president at the time was DiCarlo, and he understood that if he offered me a one-day job, that I would not take that job. And that was an insult. So rather than go through the legal ramifications of firing somebody, that's the way they made the offer. So that was one. The other factor in which Sister Rabab had raised is, where are the other people in the radical Black academic world on this document? And that was a challenge. I was a very young person at that point. I assumed that if you were Black and engaged in talking radical stuff, that and on a campus, that you would sign on to this. But time and time again, when we made phone calls or wrote letters to people, either to show them, to send them the document, we would not get a response. We would not get a response from many, many other people. And so hence, we see the paucity of university-based Black faculty members who were supposed to be quote unquote radical because of the pressure they would face for signing on to an anti-Zionist statement and a pro-Palestinian statement. And so that's a lesson that we learned coming out in this period, that your salary could be axed in a matter of 1 or 2 sentences by the powers that be, and people did not want that to happen to them. So they, rather than respond to us, they did no response. And so years later, some people became more outspoken and progressive and took that stance in terms of supporting the Palestinian struggle. But the vast majority have shied away from that, retired, shied away from being involved in that. So that shows you how powerful the Zionist forces are in collaboration with the domestic imperialist powers in the United States. How powerful that was in helping to shape an aspect of the radical Black intellectual movement, if you will, in the United States. The litmus test, in other words, was whether or not you support the Palestinian struggle, and that you would do that publicly. Privately, you do it, but do it publicly. You know, that was the issue at that point. The other challenge was raising money to get this ad placed in the Times. And fortunately, in this period of 1969, 1970, a full page or half page ad or so in the New York Times wasn't as ridiculously expensive as it is today. And so we dug into our own pockets, and we got other people who supported it to give us money anonymously and so forth. But it wasn't prohibitive. And so that's one of the reasons why it did, in fact, get into the publication of the New York Times. The responses were very swift for that period. Remember now, we're talking a period where there was no email, no internet, but within a matter of a day or two, we were getting responses. Many positive responses from the piece, and it was such that the president of Sarah Lawrence DiCarlo felt he was obligated to send a letter to the editor of the New York Times stating that Sarah Lawrence College had nothing to do with this document, and that they supported Israel and so forth and so on down the line. That's how frightened he was of losing money because of my signage. I signed as Sarah, at Sarah Lawrence College, but it was only for affiliation reasons, only. It's not by this is a statement that is supported by the institution that I work at. Anyway, that document has a link to the SNCC document, which Sister Rabab had mentioned, and I believe it's online. One of our links to the SNCC document that came out in 1967 that also had devastating effects with SNCC, and Brother Phil can talk about that. But I happened to be in the SNCC fundraising office in '67 in New York City at the time, which was located at 105th Avenue, an office donated to us by what we found out later was the Zionists. And once SNCC came out with the statement in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle that summer, the landlord called in, and Fran Beal, unfortunately Fran is not with us, she also would be able to give you the details, because I think she was the one that received the call, but I know she was in the office at the time. He said, "You have 24 hours to get out of this office." And to shut down the fundraising office, 24 hours, get all your stuff, get out. And I believe SNCC lost somewhere in the vicinity of 85 to 90% of its financial base from coming out with that statement. Brother Phil can probably fill us in on that in more details. But that was '67. So 3 years later, the Palestinian struggle is still going on, and we felt that it was important that we come up with a updated statement for the public to know how many African Americans stand with Palestine and not with Zionist Israel. So that's leading us up to 1970, which that statement in turn dealt with a number of other things particularly within New York City, in developing even a tighter solidarity with the Palestinian forces, trying to get public space for the PLO to speak in Harlem. That did happen. Get solidarity, over the years in the 70s and so forth. All of those things did happen. So that the lineage in terms of Palestinian solidarity predates that 1970 statement, predates that 1967 statement from SNCC, goes back to the time of Brother Malcolm and his efforts to publicly speak about the plight of Palestinian people, and him formally meeting and informally meeting with the Palestinian Liberation Organization representatives at the UN before his assassination. So there is this legacy that's carried on, and that there are individuals who were with Malcolm in SNCC and in the 1970s who helped to carry, physically, mentally helped to carry that legacy onward. I'll stop here, and I know there'll probably be a lot of questions that we can get into.
There is a lot, Sam, because there is all your history with the Black Panthers and everything else that we would want to talk about. As we said that, do you want to introduce Frangel, and I can just mention some of the things that she said, but we also can talk to her later and add this to the,
Sure. No, I think that's important to do. And again, thank you, Sam. I look forward to these the Q&A section. But Rabab mentioned we unfortunately cannot be joined by Bill Francis M. Beal. She's not well under the weather, but we had planned on having her. She's a longtime peace and justice Black feminist, best known for her seminal essay, Double Jeopardy, to be Black and female. She started her activism with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and continued in the Third World Women's Alliance, a prolific writer on Black politics, peace, and gender equality. Her writings have appeared in Black Scholar, Frontline News, Line of March, San Francisco Bayview, The Examiner, and other online platforms. She's now retired and living in Oakland, California. So yeah, it would be wonderful to hear some of the commentary that she shared with you.
Yeah, she shared some of the stuff with us. We were really hoping for Fran to be here because she's so prolific and she has so much stuff to say. And as Sam said, she was in the question. She was actually in that office when SNCC received the notice that you need to clean out, you need to get evicted, which also speaks about the many losses. And so what Fran was, some of the stuff, I can't actually be Fran, I'm just going to mention some of the things she told us. She said that she actually became politicized because that was one of the questions we asked everybody. How did you get to be to the point that you actually signed the statement? Nobody just wakes up and decide I'm going to sign the statement. And Sam raised questions about where were the people, and it's really interesting to kind of not to out people or not to guilt trip them or whatever, but would be really interesting to go back and see the people who did not sign at the time, who were afraid because of the chilling effect and so on. Where are they now? What is it that they are doing? How have they moved? Because I do know like a lot of people have moved from our reading of history. We all know that. So Fran said that she became politicized actually in the 61, and she was as part of Students for Africa. She was studying in France. She was a student at the Sorbonne. And also, by the way, I think Phil also mentioned that as well. The first Palestinian they met was an Algerian. Very interesting, right? And I think this is also the same thing that I think, Sam, you can speak about that, is how did this come about? But she met Algerian students in France, and this was before the liberation of Algeria. This was still was Algeria was colonized. And she became very friendly with people from the NLF, the National Liberation Front for the liberation of Algeria. People have seen the Battle of Algiers. It actually dramatizes it and so on, but there's a lot of writings about that. And we used to go to a bookstore. That was, and she will read. This is how she learned about this first. And that's how she developed her anti-colonial, anti-imperialist consciousness that later led her on. She met Arab students in a cafe in France. She became very active with them. Then she came back to the US. And then she was in SNCC, and she spoke to James Forman, who introduced her to the international affairs because she also spoke French. She could also translate and so on. So she became very active, and she became very active with multiple things. And she says that she was a Mississippi delegate. And of course, she actually refers to it. I think there was one question about Bayard Rustin, which is really an important discussion we need to talk about. Is that she felt that he played a very conservative role in the black community, and then Bayard Rustin, we know that he was not really supportive of union movement, and his agenda was on other issues also, sort of like left to the mainstream and so on. More people can speak about that. But Bayard Rustin was pushing in 1967 for black leaders to support Israel. And but a lot of black people and black leaders and black activists had a serious problem because of Vietnam and because of Israel's role in Vietnam, which was also mentioned in the statement. And also, in addition, I mean, there is a very big connection, and Palestinians, as a matter of fact, make a very big connection between the whole question of Vietnam fighting against the US being imperial power, Palestinians being very much influenced by many black activists like Muhammad Ali, who refused to go fight in Vietnam. So people kind of like also relate and learn about what does it mean. Also, at the same time, there was also Palestinians where, you don't really want to go fight in the Israeli military against the Palestinians. So there is this connection, which you also make in the statement. But she said also that it's really important that to keep in mind that this is the support with Palestine is not something new for the black community. She said actually there was a massive movement in 1898 when the US colonized Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and other places. Actually, there was a very, very big movement, black movement, opposing that. She talked about the whole question about how the black community was very supportive of Cuba. And I think this is something that you can speak about that, Sam, and also your partner, Dr. Rosemary Mealy, wrote a book about Fidel and Malcolm X. I'm not going to steal your thunder, so I'm just mentioning some of the stuff, connecting some of the dots. She said that as a black, and also one of the things that Fran spoke about being half Jewish. Fran is half Jewish, half black. And many people will always come to her and say, well, you should really be supporting Israel. And she's, no, I don't want to support Israel because of not because I'm black, but because of my anti-colonial, my anti-internationalist perspectives and so on. So she spoke about that. And she said that one of the people that she met, which I really didn't know, but she said one of the people that she really met and was very much influenced with was a woman named Georgette Ayoub, who was half Palestinian, half Lebanese. And she was, and I didn't know that because I met Georgette in Cairo when I was teaching in Cairo from 2000, 2001. I met Georgette and we were working with each other and so on, but I really never knew that Georgette was very influential in the National Alliance of Third World Women that Fran. And so Fran said that actually Georgette was the one who trained me and taught me everything about Palestine. So she mentioned a lot of things that I don't want to take all of it, because hopefully when France is out of the hospital and when she's feeling better and so on, we should actually have that and have Fran speak for herself and her own activism. Oh, then she did speak about one thing else, about that she was a secretary at one point for the National Council for Negro Women. And Healy, I think Healy was the head of it at the time. And France was talking about how Healy was being, Healy, I think, was being pressured day in and day out to sign that statement pro-Israel. And she will a lot of the time say she's not available, she's not there, tell them I'm not here, I'm not going to take the call and so on. But eventually they had her sign one, but then she said it was really amazing how Healy managed to not sign any more statements about Israel. So I think what Fran brought up here, which we can discuss, is the whole question of Bayard Rustin's role as somebody who actually worked very closely with Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. but actually took the position of being pro-Israel, and the whole question about the claim that a lot of Jews who are supported the civil rights movement were Zionists. And by the way, there aren't really claims. There isn't. It's a claim. It's not really. There isn't foundation about that. There's some were supportive, some were not supportive. She also spoke about how the pressure to the, and we also, like last time we talked about the ways in which there is this supposedly letter going around that Martin Luther King wrote to an anti-Zionist friend telling him change, and it turns out there is no such letter. It doesn't really exist, actually. And now the Zionist press admitted finally that there is no such letter. There is rumors that there was a letter. So there is a lot of these kind of stories that are being circulated and so on to speak about the Jewish support for the civil rights movement, including the two young Jewish men who were martyred when they were part of Freedom Summer and so on. And so the claim is to talk about it as if this Jewish presence was supportive of Israel. But there is no basis to actually make that argument, because historically, people who participated in the civil rights movement and in Black liberation and support and so on participated on the basis of being anti-slavery, anti-colonialism, support of liberation, and so on. It wasn't necessarily in support of Israel per se, but that is something that we actually should talk about, because I think that also requires some demystification, aside from the discussion about, and maybe Gail, you can speak about that, the ways some people say this is because in the Black church, and then they say the church as if there is one church and there is one Black and there is one history. I mean, it's also, even in that sense, very problematic. The Black church always talks about Zion, talks about Israel and so on, but it's actually about a particular church. So I think this is all these discussions, we can actually bring them up, because, your father, there is a lot of, actually, I knew a lot of people in Harlem who, Father Lucas, a whole bunch of people who were actually, and I mean, that's how I met them. I met them because we used to go to Harlem all the time, get invited to go and speak about Palestine. So if they were so much pro-Israel and pro-Zionist, how would they invite us? It doesn't really make sense. So I think there are issues that actually we need to disentangle and decipher in our discussion. And so I'm going to stop here so we can talk about, the various things around the statement and so on. And I would like to also talk about the statement the statement itself before we open it up for discussion. So I'm going to throw it back at you, Gail, and then we can also talk with our, just have a conversation with our participants, with our panelists.
Yeah.
And Salim and Anais, feel free whenever you want to jump in and you say something too. So.
Absolutely. I'll just very briefly, I think that you make a very good point about this. The Black community not being a monolithic community, the faith community not being monolithic. And too often, there are just these incredible sweeping claims that get made. And they're all trying to sort of, I think, connect with that Zionist position. There was a op-ed piece that was written several years ago by, a couple of years ago, by Michelle Alexander, talking about making the connection for herself personally between Martin Luther King's visit to Riverside Church and his speaking out against Vietnam, and she paralleled that with her, her commitment to stand up and speak out against the horrific treatment of our Palestinian family. And we're reminded of this time and time again, as Sam was talking about all of the pressures that have been put on, organizations, individuals, colleges, universities, to take a pro-Israeli position for fear of losing jobs, tenure in the case of Sam, money, and that was the kind of pressure that continues, that was, I think, very much in play and continues to be in play. And so it's interesting when you think about the ways that the various institutions are really intimidated, how that continues to absolutely be the case. Never mind mainstream politics, when we think about AIPAC and all of those, the Zionist lobby and that kind of that kind of strangulation. I'll just quickly say that one of the things that, and that IFCO ran into when we, where our 501c3, our tax exempt status was threatened and then eventually taken away, was that we were attacked by the so-called liberal, Democrats and the Tea Party. I mean, and they were hand in glove, with their attack on IFCO, saying, how could this organization have tax exempt status and be supporting the people of Palestine? Of course, they didn't put it that way. They supporting terrorism, because of course they've got to equate it with these nefarious claims. But
Steve, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? There's something that I want to add.
Please, we can hear you. Please do.
Okay, all right. All of this propaganda that was put out about Zionist support for the civil rights movement, let's not forget that one of the important issues was Israel's relations with South Africa and the apartheid regime, and the role that Israeli intelligence and Israeli military advisors played in supporting apartheid. So there was never any question in the minds of people who were involved in the Southern African liberation movements that Israel was one of the enemies of the anti-apartheid movement. And that superseded for every person that said we must support Israel because it supports the civil rights movement, because Jewish citizens support the civil rights movement. There were 20 people who pointed out rightfully that Israel was one of the biggest supporters of South Africa and Rhodesia, and one of those who prolonged the apartheid regime's existence. So we mustn't forget that.
Can I
when
just
that
add something
argument
about
comes
South
up.
Africa?
And
Yeah.
I wanted.
Oh no, I'm not. You're
Beg your
not finished
pardon?
when you finish. I wanted to add something about Southern Africa too.
Yeah, and I wanted to suggest that one of the people that can be contacted about SNCC and its history with respect to the struggle is Fanny Rushing in Chicago. Sam knows her. She worked in SNCC for a good many years, and she's now running the SNCC History Project. And she's got a wealth of information. And as a matter of fact, the next time you have a program like this, you might want to contact Fanny and see if she would be available. And finally, my last word is that there was a very interesting thing that happened when I traveled with Marty Mensch to get his daughter, Barbara, who was, as I said, only 16 years old. Every stop we made, Marty and I, on our journey, we were met by, or he was met by FBI and CIA people who kept telling him that it was a trap, that in fact I was working for the Palestinians and my task was to deliver Marty Mensch to the Palestinians. He was a very wealthy man, very wealthy, and an expert in certain aspects of the law, and that I was to deliver him to the Palestinians because he was much more valuable as a hostage than his 16-year-old daughter was. And
Can you say more about this, Robert? Can you say more
Beg pardon?
about because you spoke very quickly, because one of the things that has happened last month, our webinar was censored by Zoom and then by Facebook and YouTube because one of our guests was Layla Khalid, and the Zionist groups basically kept saying she was one of the hijackers. I don't think she was the hijacker of that plane, the TWA. I think it was another one. This is one of them, right? She wasn't on that plane with Layla.
Well,
But
that
she was
was
mentioned. I'm saying Barbara, but can you speak a little bit more about that? Because they're making very big deal out of it, how Palestinians were terrorists, were doing all of. So if you can
yes.
clarify a little bit, would be really great if you don't mind.
Yes, they did do that. They did do that. And as a matter of fact, at one point, I said to Marty as we were traveling, I said, "You're very brave and courageous to make this journey with me of all people, because you're being warned that I'm in on it, and that my job is to turn you over to the Palestinians, and they don't have to hijack anything else, just deliver you to them. And he said that, you know, he was going to tell me why, that he wasn't so brave and why he was going on this journey with me. And I said, go ahead, what is it? And he said, you've never been married to a Jewish mother, have you? And I said, no, no. I laughed, but he said that that was why he had to go to get his daughter. And as a matter of fact, when we came back and his daughter was talking about the Palestinians who were killed getting kosher food for the rabbi, uh, the New York Post ran that story once, and then they stopped running it and they stopped interviewing her because she came out supporting the Palestinians. After her experience, she was an avid supporter of the Palestinians. I don't know where she is now. I have no idea, because I was never really in touch with her before we went to get her. Her father is dead,
She has
I
a
know.
few interviews here and there, but she actually, when the reason she was on the plane that was hijacked, because she was also living on a kibbutz in Israel.
Yes,
So
that's right.
this also
She
changed. I
spent
mean,
the
this also
summer
defies.
in a
Yeah, this
kibbutz.
defies the Zionist narrative that Palestinians were actually singling out Jews and
Yeah,
so on, because that this doesn't really
yeah.
stand
But
to the
that
historical
wasn't
record.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she really spoke out in favor of the Palestinians when we got back, and they did not like that, so that's why they decided to shut her up. If you're in touch with her, please tell her I said hello.
No, I'm not in touch with her, but she's one of the people I'm actually looking forward to interviewing, because the webinar was called Whose Narratives, and we really wanted to engage in histories, in kind of like thinking about what happened, just like we're doing today. What happened 50 years ago? How do people understand it? What is the role of women in the movement? What's
Yeah,
going on? Because the Palestinian movement, just like the Black movement, just like other movements, is always accused of being overtly homophobic, overtly
yeah,
misogynist, does not support
yeah,
women, and so on. But we have all these life examples from the way back when until today of strong women who are speaking. So there was a very strong interest for the Zionists to actually silence, not enable people to actually speak. It wasn't, I mean, when we invited Layla Khalid, we did not invite her to talk about hijackings. We invited her to talk, which is, there is another place for it. I'm not saying you shouldn't talk about it, but that wasn't the goal of the webinar. The goal of the webinar
yeah.
was talk about gender justice and resistance. And we actually had two Jewish participants. We had Ronnie Kasriels from South Africa, from the ANC, and we had
Mhm.
Laura Whitehorn, who's anti-Zionist Jewish former prisoner in New York, who spent 14 years in prison and now working on releasing aged people in prison. And we had Seiko Odinga, who was 33 years in prison, who was also in the Organization of African
Sekou
Unity, by
Odinga?
the way.
Yes,
Seiko Odinga. And we had
yes.
also the director of the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, which is the oldest institute in the region around women's studies. I mean, despite what the Zionists say and so on. And so this was a very interesting thing for the Zionists to actually silence it, because it would have defied all the narratives, exactly like we're
Yeah,
kind of talking about. What was the history all about? What was going on at that particular time? What's going on today? What does this mean for the issues and so on? What does it mean for our students? I mean, what we're trying to do is that I show the film Layla Khalid Hijacker in my classes, and I've written about Layla Khalid as I written about Asata Shakur and other. So I thought this would be really amazing to actually bring a live person. I mean, this is like, imagine the treat of all of you being available for our students to hear from you. This is something that's not even written. It's
well,
it's so
one
amazing,
last
all these
thing,
stories. Yeah, yeah.
one
Go
last
ahead.
thing that Marty Mensch did for me is when we were in Amman,
Hmm.
and we were under fire from the Jordanian military. We were with the Palestinians, and we were under fire from the Jordanian military. As a matter of fact, at one point we went out for a walk, and a tank leveled 50 caliber machine guns at us, and we threw our hands up in the air quickly. But um, while we were on a balcony and there was shooting going on, um, I was talking with Marty about wanting to go make a film in Mozambique. And he said, he's got one piece of advice for me. He said, don't worry about the law firm. Don't worry about going back to the firm. Go make your film because, you know, you should never pass up an opportunity to do something that you really want to do that's worthwhile. And that's much more important than working for the law firm. And he sort of inspired me to quit the firm when we got back and go off with Bob Fletcher to make the films. So I always thanked, in my mind, I always thanked Marty for giving me that encouragement. Now
I
I'll
assume
shut up.
Marty also gave you some money.
No, he didn't. He didn't. Once I left the firm, I lost that decent salary.
Yeah.
Ambassador, can you
but
just
maybe-
move
maybe I should have asked
screen? Can you just move your screen a little bit because your half of your face is
Yes,
showing?
I'm sorry.
If you could just like move it a little bit. Yeah, this is no, a little bit. No, back. Yeah, okay. So I want to
No,
get it back to
Sam, you have a good idea. I should have asked
Yeah.
him for some money. I should have, but I didn't. I didn't plan it too well.
Okay, too late now. But
Yeah,
let's take it back
definitely
to.
too late now.
Just make sure your camera, your
Your
half of
face
your
is in
face-
centered.
Yeah, so this is good.
Yeah.
But if you move, just watch over the camera. So I'm gonna
Okay.
throw it back at Gail
I certainly
and
could
Sam
have
and
asked
Phil,
him
and
for
then we'll
help
come
with
back
my
to you,
roof.
Ambassador.
I
We'll come
Very
back to
good.
you, Ambassador, because we
help
actually
with my
have
roof.
a lot of discussion. We want to talk about the statement as well. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
get it back to you, Gail, and Phil and Sam, and maybe Salim and Anais want to say something.
I just,
Go ahead.
yeah, quick question. I mean, to try to get Sam and Phil and back in, and yes, Salim and any input, it would be welcome. But in terms of response, and you touched a little bit on it, Sam, but I specifically want to ask Phil and Sam, what kind of, can you just say a little bit more about the actual responses that you received at that time to the document? I mean, aside from the pushback you mentioned at Sarah Lawrence, but who were some of those, and what were some of those voices like of people who were particularly responding affirmatively in 1970 at such a message?
Phil, I guess I'll go and then maybe Phil.
Okay.
The folks in the community, let's see. I was living in Harlem at the time, and a lot of people read the New York Times, and then the Grapevine, before the internet, there was the thing we called Grapevine, would send copies, and people would get them. And the responses from ordinary folk to my university colleagues was very positive. Like I said before, those individuals in Black academia that I touched base with to try to get them to sign on, they didn't respond, but everybody else did. It was a positive response. We tried at one point, meaning Bill Strickland and I, and probably a couple of other people, tried to get a interview going within the Amsterdam News. But then again, Zionism gets in the way. The Amsterdam News had a lot of ads coming in from big and small corporations, local and national. And I guess the editor, I forgot his name at the time, the publisher was skittish about doing that, because it was newsworthy. Here were a group of Black people putting together an advertisement and posting it in the New York Times, dealing with the hot issue of the Palestinian struggle. So it was newsworthy. It was something obviously that people were curious about. So I got phone calls, a couple of letters of people in support. But one thing I did not get, which was interesting, was hate mail. I did not get that. So they knew that I was at Sarah Lawrence College. I did not get hate mail, which was, I was ready for it. I was, like you're ready, you're geared up.
Right,
It didn't come.
right.
It didn't come. My gut feeling was that the statement was too black, too strong, and that to give it a negative light in the public, to give it a negative light in the public, will just spread like a virus, just go out even further. So rather than come down on and with your typical hate mail kind of stuff, comments in the newspapers and what have you, or on television, the opposition, the Zionists and the capitalists who supported Zionism, would just stay silent on it. Just went over.
Can I just say something about this?
Interesting.
I think it's very interesting because it's like I think a couple of things. I'm not sure if I'm right. You know what? I'm gonna shut down Facebook. Okay. So I think I was looking at Facebook because it has captioning, so I can watch it better. But I think there is a couple of issues, and I don't know if this is true, but I think one is historically. I think also Zionist responses and so on also develop and grow and so on. So there isn't one particular one. Every context has its own thing. I think secondly, and this basically I think defies the Zionist claim that the Zionists were so influential in the Black support for the civil rights movement. There definitely were the Zionist Organization of America. There definitely was the Zionist embassy. There were the people that you already cited in the statement. But in terms of kind of grassroots and so on, this was just beginning. 67 was a very important turning point because it was when there is a whole lot of history that people have written about. Many Jewish writers, anti-Zionist writers and so on have written about. But it was there, many people, I think, either in the civil rights movement were supportive of the civil rights movement, making a distinction between black power and civil rights and so on. All of these things are there. But in the civil rights movement, there was a strong Jewish presence. But I don't really think that strong Jewish presence was Zionist. I think it took a while for that Zionist sentiment to develop and to grow and become more vocal. I think many Jews who were participating in the peace and justice movement in anywhere and so on, and there are other people who can speak better to the labor movement and Steve Applebaum and so on. But historically, it was people who actually came out of the 20s, of the struggle around the whole question of the socialists, communists, anarchists, and so on, the union movement, the support, also the support against Nazism and fascism and so on, Second World War, cautious around actually whether to support the US power or not to support power, because there was also the Soviet Union at that time and the socialist camp and so on. And then but then I think something broke in McCarthyism. Because it was a very, and then that's where also some of the Zionist forces developed. So that's, I don't want us to kind of get into this too much because it eclipses what we're talking about, the statement. But I think that is one major issue, is that it's the history. And a lot of the time people only talk about Black history separately around Palestine. They talk about Jewish history and Zionism separately, Israeli history. And I think one of the things we try to do in these open classrooms and in these conversations, to bring these histories together, to speak to each other. Because when they speak to each other, it yields a lot of maybe it yields even more questions, which is okay. I think that's like the best way for actually to learn and know and draw lessons for. So that's, I think the other thing is that I think Zionists also are sort of like strategize and think about whether to do or not to do, because there have been a lot of attacks recently. I mean, first of all, you lost your job. So what else are they going to do to you? I mean, so they're going to send you a couple of I receive a lot of hate mail, but I still have my job. I mean, neither the Zionists nor the university have figured out how to, aside from harassment and retaliation every single day, they haven't figured out how to get rid of me, right? But you have your job. I mean, you lost your job. Fred Dubé in 1985 lost his job. He was fired by Como. Many people, Mark Lamont Hill was fired from CNN. Angela Davis the award was rescinded until there was a huge movement by many of us, everybody, and made the movement until the award was rescinded and, you know, given back and so on. So I think there is kind of like, I think the Zionists are always testing their grounds, because they're also, for instance, they've been attacking a lot of anti-Zionist Jews, a lot of anti-Zionist scholars and so on. And at some point they stopped doing it. Not because there are lesser, there are actually more anti-Zionist scholars and so on. But I think now they're thinking about, first of all, the right-wing agenda and the Zionist agenda are sort of almost the same, like, you know, and white supremacists. They're almost the same. They support all the attacks against people who are protesting today. They're attacking, they're supporting Trump with the whole attack on ethnic studies, critical ethnic. I mean, the agenda is really terrible. They're in the White House. This is their connection, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think that they, one of the things is that it's very convenient for them to just target Palestinians, Arabs or Muslims, because it's very clear for them then to say this is the enemy. Kind of like the enemy has a name, has a last name, has a religion, has a face, has an accent, and so on. And a lot of the Zionist framing, just like the statement, it's about the national security of the United States. Just like in 67 and Vietnam, that this will be really good for the national security for the United States. By the way, a lot of support for South Africa also by the Zionists was also justifying why Israel is supporting South Africa. There is no justification that this is in the best interest of the United States. Israel is really important in the region because this is a strategic point of the United States. I mean, they keep framing it again and again. And then when you say, what's the interest of the United States? Definitely the interest of the government, not the interest of the people. It definitely does not reduce the prisoners. It doesn't give people welfare. It doesn't give people health care. It doesn't give people climate justice. It doesn't, okay? So when they say that, and now there is a very, very big emphasis among the Zionists, especially ideologues, like Campus Watch, Middle East Forum, the ones who are doing the theorizing, they are focusing a lot around the whole question of the national security. And then there is the dog whistle around Black activists, in the sense that they are very much supporting the FBI, considering movement for Black Lives a terrorist movement. I mean, this is sort of like Contil Broback again. So I think they are actually, one of the things is kind of like defining the enemy. And it's very easy to make the enemy Arab, Palestinian, and Muslims, because it also gives the message to everybody else, don't even bother. It doesn't concern you. This is which goes back to the statement. Why did the statement in black statement come out around Palestine? Because it's a question of justice. It's a question of solidarity. It's not really a question of, you know, kind of like, oh, just because we love the Palestinians. So I think there is kind of like, and they have, and if you look at their strategies, which this is not, we should have another webinar about that. But here, I think this is, it all comes to it, because sometimes they attack and sometimes they seize. Sometimes they attack, and sometimes some rogue elements do it, and sometimes it's the people who are the leaders do it. But definitely, Israeli government has, I mean, Richard Spencer has already said that he's a white Zionist after Charlottesville. Israeli Prime Minister son Yair Netanyahu said that Antifa and Movement for Black Lives are worse for Israel than the right-wing white supremacists and so on. I mean, this is, the alliances are so clear. Trump is very clear who is he catering to. Sheldon Adelson, who is one of the mega multimillionaires who's supporter of Israel in Las Vegas, who's pouring tons of money now and has poured tons of money, especially after Trump moved the US embassy to Jerusalem and so on. They are very much invested in a very right-wing agenda. I mean, when you talk about privatization of education and so on, this is, it's, we have a holistic agenda, and these people have a very anti-injustice, very white supremacist. And then don't forget the whole question of the collaboration in the whole question of policing and suppression and surveillance and so on between Israel and the US police. And I refuse to call them law and order, because I don't want to even acknowledge legitimization of that, okay? So I think this is all of the stuff is right there, and it definitely affects the Black leadership, Black activists, and so on. It affects all activists, indigenous, Asian American, Latinx. It affects Jewish anti-Zionists. It affects people who are working in labor, working people, and so on. It affects everybody, because it's such, like the guy, I will just end with this guy, Rick Lamborn, who attacked us after we had the webinar. He's a right-wing congressman from Colorado Springs. I check his record. He's the one who went to the Department of Justice and the Attorney General and said we should be investigated, my colleague and I, for criminal charges for doing this webinar, right? So what is his agenda? He's terrible on the climate. He supports Trump. He supported Trump against impeachment. He supports the police in Portland. He is against women. He's against every single thing you can think about. The guy is a complete right-wing agenda that aligns. So I think it also contests the previous things of actually always saying progressive except on Palestine, because now this is reactionary on everything, including Palestine, and we are in a different kind of like place where which I think the statement that you've done actually really, to go back to the statement, actually defines what the politics is then, and it defines what the politics is now. So
it's interesting because I mean, and what you just said in terms of the connection to the police mechanism, whatever you want to refer to it. I mean, that's very much along the lines of what Bob was saying, the ambassador was saying about apartheid, that historic link and connection. But Phil, I wanted to bring you in and ask you. Did you have any comments that you wanted to make about the response at that time to the letter you recall, and also just take a moment to remind people to please put your questions in the chat. If there are any questions you have for any of the panelists, it'd be great to hear from those who are listening in. But Phil, are you still with us, Phil?
I must admit, I'm not feeling too well this morning.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
But,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problems. But I did have a couple of things to say about this. And I was having a little bit of a thinking about the statement in 1970 and why I wasn't totally on top of the reaction to it. And I realized I was in Cuba most of 1970, and they were setting up the Venceremos brigades. And I was there about 7 months overall on 3 different trips. So I was aware of the statement. Obviously, I signed it, and SNCC was beginning to fall apart at the same time nationally, and so I'm a little foggy, and to the degree that I remember it, it was more geared around intellectual debate and stuff around newspapers and the debate at that level, not so much in the community. I don't remember in the community so much debate. I could be wrong. Third point I want to say, though, which is what I do remember strongly, is the statement that we did in 1967, and that created a tremendous amount of controversy, which I think bled into the 1970 statement. Because the thing that we said was Zionism is a form of racism. And that really polarized a lot of people, because it wasn't talking just about Israel. It was basically talking about the people, particularly American liberals, who supported Zionism. And so it's like, oh, am I a racist because I support Zionism? And some of the liberal Jews in and around SNCC and the movement felt they could do both, that they could basically be a supporter of Israel and support the civil rights movement and groups like SNCC. So when SNCC would take statements, in this case against Zionism, and they had to really think more personally where they stood and in regard to the struggle in the United States, and got very defensive. And I remember a tremendous amount of feedback on that level, and trying to, I mean, you don't even hear the statement that much anymore, Zionism is racism, which was the statement that basically came out of that document. It came out of a study that SNCC did around the state of Israel in 1966 and 1967. And basically coming out with the idea that Israel was a racist colonial nation. And that basically formed the organization's politics around the question of Israel and who Israel was and why they were playing such a role in South Africa or Southern Africa, and so on. So I just want to put that point in, because that predated the 1970 statement and created a lot of the rancor and division and debate, internal in SNCC and other people. And for a lot of our quote white friends, associating with SNCC was getting to be dangerous because we had come out against the war in Vietnam. We supported the Vietnamese Revolution, 66 Black Power, and then Zionism is racism, and then of course the statement in the New York Times in 1970. So there's a progression of events there that all are basically sharpening the debate and making it harder for liberals, particularly, who, in terms of being able to straddle both camps, made it much harder for them to do.
We see in the chat, there's a link to that statement, the SNCC policy statements on Palestine. So that's good. Sam, do you agree with Rabab's analysis from the Black perspective that Bayard Rustin question is I think an interesting conversation piece. Do you have any comments or thoughts around that?
Bayard, as he aged, he became more reactionary. He became more cynical of the struggle, and he isolated himself from the younger forces that were coming up. He was in Harlem, but he isolated himself from those of us who were coming up, and he was very hostile, instantly hostile towards us. I think his allies were his close allies, people who would not criticize him or critique him on his slipping to the right, were those liberal Jews that floated around in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the literary crowd, as well as some of the older leadership of the trade union movement in New York City at that time, that he associated. He had an audience. They did not criticize him. So my sense is that there was a subjective factor that led him to be pro-Israel more than the objective factor of seeing Israel as a surrogate police state for the U.S. The subjective factor there was, he had people who supported, who did not criticize his movement. He began to drift away even from the sisters and brothers who were in SLC in New York City area, right? Wyatt T. Walker, for example. He drifted away from it. And I think the other factor that has to play in this is that he was an elder gay Black man, and in a period where the gay movement was ignited and growing, and he had my sense is that he had the opportunity to be explicitly part of that, and help it put the political aspects of that and help it push it forward, but he opted not to do that, and so in his latter part of his life, I'm really sensed that this was a brother in internal turmoil within himself about a number of things. He became increasingly bitter, right, about the left, if you will, this cloud called the left. Very much like George Schuyler, which a lot of people don't know, was a Black man who was a leftist, and he also participated in the United Negro Improvement Association, the Garvey movement, and he, for whatever reasons, he began to drift. He drifted to be as far right as John Birch Society, right? It was crazy. He came all the way from the left, all the way over to the right over time. A very bitter man. He tried to raise his daughter, Philippa Schuyler, in some crazy way of being the most European of young Black girls as possible. And it just was a massive confusion for her. And she committed suicide before she was even, I think, 40 years old. But she was brilliant. She was a brilliant pianist. She was a journalist. She went to Vietnam as one of the few Black women in Vietnam reporting on the war and so on. But you know, we as a people have these kinds of people that come up out of the movement that have made major contributions to pushing the progressive causes forward, but then for a number of different reasons wind up being bitter and chewing in on themselves to such a point where anybody who's Black and progressive is bad, right? And you know, there's a number of people who we can point out that have morphed into that kind of being. So that's my sense of where in the 1970s, where brother was in Harlem, living his life, getting it on a daily, very, very bitter. We would see him sometime on the street and try to greet him, and he would just ignore you like you were a piece of dirt, you know, just ignore you, you know. It was like, oh, okay, all right. And then,
Wow.
Next time I won't talk to you, you know.
I won't engage. Wow, that's a shame.
Gail, could I say one other thing?
Sure.
This is about Bayard Rustin,
Sure.
because he was very influential in SNCC and around SNCC in the early 60s.
Right.
And a lot of people know. And Bayard was a great activist, a brilliant man. And unfortunately, his politics, which became separated from SNCC and the general movement, the key place was in Atlantic City in 1964. And people may remember with Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Democratic Party wanting to unseat the racist state delegation of Mississippi and take their seats. And Lyndon Johnson basically coming out against that. And the politics of the liberal democratic and labor politics that Bayard championed was basically going toward power. And their major goal is to get Hubert Humphrey president of the United States.
Right.
And at a certain point, Bayard realized as a gay person, he could be around power, but couldn't actually get power for himself or his direct movements. And so he had to figure out who his allies were. And his allies in terms of getting power were to the right, which was the mainstream Democratic Party. And I think I say this because I think that's the point where everything gelled in terms of the conflict. And ever after that, he went increasingly to the right. Yeah. He tried to convince the civil rights movement not to stop demonstrations and get into what he called coalition politics. I have a book in my library where she writes about the importance of coalition politics. But who's the coalition with? It's basically the mainstream Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson, and also forces to the right, and not building an independent grassroots movement, which he himself had been so much in favor of in the early 60s.
Right. You know, this is fascinating, interesting. I know that we really do want to be able to talk about the future and kind of where the direction of things. I know I've got a question about whether we think such a statement now could happen, but there's a couple of questions already in the chat. One is a person asked, I was wondering if you could mention a little more about the early pro-Palestinian position taken by the Nation of Islam and the influence of SNCC, of Ms. Ethel Minor, and Dr. Kwame Ture, especially in the 1967 newsletter and later the statement. So can anybody speak to that history?
I think maybe Phil can, may you all can speak to that. I can speak about the whole question of Islam and Malcolm X,
Okay,
but
well,
let somebody
I don't
else
know that
speak
much
about
about
that.
the Nation of Islam and Palestine, but in terms of the latter part of the question, people like Ethel Minor and Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, they were major people. And I mean, I think in terms of Stokely, it came a lot out of his West Indian background and the kind of people who have been radicals from the West Indies consistently over time on international questions. And Stokely was very upfront about supporting Palestine, and because he was such a brilliant debater, and he loved philosophical arguments. He delighted in putting defenders of Israel kind of on the defensive, and of course making them angrier, and because he was such a good debater, so he played because in SNCC history. I mean, even before he was chairman, I mean, he was definitely around internationalism, supporting South Africa, supporting movements that they were in the Caribbean, and also, of course, making ties with Native Americans, indigenous people in the United States, and so that had a lot to do with his support of Palestine, because they were the indigenous people of that area. And Ethel was one of the people who worked a lot on the statement that from the 67 study of Israel that I mentioned. She and Jack Minnis, who was a white researcher, very brilliant guy, and he's from the South, and they spent some time looking at the different policy of the Israeli government, the economics of the Israeli government, and its relationships with, of course, other places in the world, as they tried to get more entry outside of the Middle East. And they felt it was very reactionary and also definitely very racist. And so they played a tremendous role on that level as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And in terms of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm formed the newspaper Muhammad Speaks. And because the Nation of Islam did not have editors and journalists, he made a collaborative. He made he created a partnership with Woodford.
John Woodford, yeah.
Right, and in Chicago, when Woodford was a brother who came out of the Communist Party, and the agreement was that he could cover X number of pages with news, as long as Nation of Islam had, I think it was 8 pages or 10 pages in the Muhammad Speak. So Woodford's internationalist politics came through the newspaper, the coverage of the Vietnam War, the coverage of the Palestinian struggle, the coverage of Algeria, the coverage of the beginnings of the African liberation struggles in Southern Africa, the coverage of how he covered issues in the United States in terms of racism. That shaped Muhammad Speaks, and so when you look at it from on high, it seemed like a contradiction, right? What you hear from what Elijah Muhammad says and what the newspaper is presenting in terms of news analysis is oftentimes two different things. But Palestine and the struggle in Palestine was in the paper on a weekly, sometimes on a weekly basis, but at worst on a monthly basis. So Black people, ordinary, everyday Black folk who would pick up tens of thousands, who would pick up Muhammad Speak, would get news analysis about the Palestinian struggle and about all these other struggles in the world that they would never, ever be able to get from TV news or the local capitalist newspapers. So that influence, the Muhammad Speaks, I really feel somebody needs to study that, how it impacted in the Black community. If the study hasn't been done already, if it has, it should be publicized. How that paper had a significant impact, and particularly in the urban centers of the United States, in terms of young people's development of the worldview. The other factor is that with Brother Kwame Ture is that he comes out of New York City, and New York City was relatively unique in terms of cities in the United States. New York City was a Black cosmopolitan center. That is to say, you did not have just Black folk coming in from Georgia and Mississippi and North Carolina to your town. You had Black folk coming in from all over the world, and their impact in New York City as a Black cosmopolitan center was very, very solid. Was very, very solid. That you would run into easily somebody from some other part of the African diaspora in New York City. The saying back in those days was that in 1970 or 1967 or 65, if you stood on the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue for 15 minutes, and you were from, let's say, Namibia, you would wind up meeting somebody who you know from your area. You know, I mean, it was that type of cosmopolitan, and I think that helped shape. I know it shaped me. I know it shaped Brother Kwame Ture. You know, coming out of a cosmopolitan, Black cosmopolitan place like New York City.
Okay, I wanna say
Can I say a small point? Add something to what you said. Is that Diane also worked for Muhammad Speaks?
Oh, okay. So Phil is speaking. I'll hold off. Go ahead, Phil.
No, it's just a short point. He was talking about Muhammad Speaks. And I was Diane Nash, who a lot of people may have known from the early civil rights struggle in the South. She basically moved to Chicago, where she still is, and she worked for years on Muhammad Speaks also. Not in this, not to the degree that John Woodford did around policy, but she was there around local issues and played a role.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak about Muhammad Speaks, but I was actually thinking about that. When you mentioned that, Sam, I was actually thinking about Mujahid. Mujahid was the paper for the Algerian National Liberation Front, that at one point Frantz Fanon was the editor. Right. And the reason my mind went there is because you've mentioned several things. I mean, first of all, actually, the Kwame Ture, doesn't his family also comes from the Caribbean? Same as Ilan Bebrar, by the way. And so then we have Frantz Fanon, we have Stuart Hall, Allah yarhamu, rest in power. We have MSSR. I mean, there is something about, I think, the Caribbean legacy and the Caribbean intervention and so on. And then when you can also add the Spanish Caribbean, like the colonial powers and the anti-colonial, I think there is something there. And you talked about Garvey. I mean, there is all of this stuff, and the Jamaica and so on, and Cuba. There is something there. I think it needs to kind of like be brought in. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because of the whole Black internationalism. Because a lot of the time you talked about cosmopolitan and so on. And I think it's also wherever people are at, because, SNCC was in the South. SNCC wasn't in the North. Okay, and SNCC, people developed that kind of politics and that kind of understanding So I think one of the things is to think about maybe the connections, what happened, who met whom, and so on. And I remember, Phil, I was quoting you earlier that you said when we had an event in San Francisco, you said that the first Palestinian I met was an Algerian. And then when Nesbeth Crutchfield and Terry Collins spoke from the Black Student Union, they said that they actually, some of them have never ever met a Palestinian. Actually, Terry Collins learned all about Palestine from a Jewish anti-Zionist friend in the same place in Minnesota. So the reason I'm saying this is like there is so many grounds and there is so many roots that come in, but there is also, it raises also a question that we were talking about a little bit earlier about the let's say not maybe necessarily theological question, but the question of faith, the question of the quote unquote black churches, let not just all black church, because Southern Christian Leadership Conference stayed away from that, from Palestine for a while. Okay, some there were contradictory positions during 67 and so on, but then SCLC actually came out in support of Palestinian youth who were trying to challenge the settler only buses a few years ago, before I think it was before Ferguson or something. But then you also have this very strong trend against Muslims in Islamophobia. That's not only the property within black churches, everywhere. But the thing is that, and it's also, there is the whole question of the Zionist influence within the Jewish religious community as well. So I'm bringing all of these issues not to actually say any conclusions, but to complicate the question and think that this is something that's actually really worthwhile thinking about. Talking it also about Islamophobia. And I keep remembering Malcolm's speech in the ballot or the bullet. He says, they always say to me, Muslim minister. They never ever refer to Adam Clayton Powell or even Martin Luther as a Christian minister. They are Christian ministers. So there was this kind of like maybe foreignizing or the foreignness of Muslims and so on, even though the Nation of Islam actually is a homegrown, is in the US thing and so on. So there is something about that, and there is something about the Zionist discourse around the whole question of Africa and history and so on. And this is also very prominent in the South African evangelical Zionist, pro-Zionist movements, and the ways in which Israel and the Zionist movement is actually trying to bring South African blacks, to take them to Israel in order to change the whole equation and the whole history and mess up with the narrative around apartheid, around Namibia, around Zimbabwe, around South Africa, and so on. So I think this is something that's really worthy of us to think about: the internationalism, the history, the ways in which, I guess I want to get to the point where the construction of black people and people in the United States are quote unquote domestic, kind of like domestic versus foreign. You're only supposed to be concerned about domestic issues. You're not supposed to be concerned as people of color, as indigenous people, black people. You're not supposed to be interested in international issues, or i.e. this is foreign policy. That doesn't really, and then the construction of Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians as foreign do not belong here. And then the whole question is like, why are you even bothering with that? You shouldn't really, you have your own concerns. Don't even bother with it. And this statement and the history defies that. But there is also these other questions that I think really need to be discussed and really need to be complicated and really need to be studied and kind of like elaborated upon and so on. I agree about the cosmopolitan, because I was fortunate to meet Kwame Ture and like hear what he says. And the All African People's Revolutionary Party was also a socialist, progressive movement as well. So I think that kind of politics is not outside of it. It wasn't white. It wasn't Cold War, sort of like, this whole anti-communist and so on. So that has also something to do with it, and has to do with the capital and respectability and how people are supposed to behave and so on.
As we look at the clock, because we're kind of getting, short on time, and I know you mentioned this, Rabab, and I know others are really interested in talking about the future, where we're going. There's so many great questions. There was one question about the religious delegations or delegations sent between Arab-based religious institutions and Black-based religious institutions. And I think that that's something, and I'm really proud of this young man he's one of the applicants for the Latin America School of Medicine who's tuned in. So glad to see him here. And it's a really good and important conversation. I think something that we at IFCO need to be talking with you, Rabab, and others at how we can expand on that kind of partnership, that really kind of important partnership in the future. I know there's been conversations with progressive faith-based institutions more recently about such a thing. But I just want to jump to a question that Omar Zazait put in the chat, saying it's interesting to go back to these moments of solidarity because they help remind all of us that expressions of solidarity today actually have a long history that includes legacies of internationalism and radical joint struggle. Sometimes we fall into the trap of assuming that what we experience in the present is completely unique. My question for all of the panelists is, how do you see the legacy of that letter, that 1970 statement, in relation to the current wave of joint struggle and solidarity with Palestine happening? And I would even just link on the struggles that are in the streets right here and now, as we're fighting the litany, the George Floyds, and on and on and on. So, you know, how do we make that connection? What are the lessons that we can learn?
I think that the question was raised about what about statement today. I think that's a starting point. I think you know, if we can get a version 2 or whatever we want to call it statement in terms of Black people in solidarity with Palestine in the 21st century, that's a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Post-pandemic attempts at which has been ongoing, formally sending groups of Black folk to Palestine, if they can get into Palestine, you know, to see and show solidarity on the ground there is another form of action. I think getting city councils to pass resolutions stating solidarity with the Palestinian struggle is something also that's important that we can do. But the knowledge base is poor in our community. We have to now re-educate our people about the struggles of Palestinians, and so that's something that we can take up, starting with a statement and strategically placing that. I don't know. Now we have social media; we can go beyond the printed media. You know, having a statement and then following that up with suggested things to read, people to invite to do further follow-through presentations and so forth on that. We have to rebuild something that was more or less on solid footing 50 years ago. We have to rebuild that. And that takes a lot of time and nitty-gritty work. But I think concretely we can start with the effort of a new statement coming out of the present reality and linking it to the 1970, the 50-year-old statement, and then working it from there. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, I will say a couple of things, and then I will maybe Phil also and Robert want to say something, and then leave it to you, Gail, to close. I want to say a couple of things. Yes, I want to just mention that actually Sam was going to go to Palestine and ended up in Jordan and wasn't allowed to cross the bridge to go to speak to Palestinians, actually about Black liberation and social movements, which is, we have a lot of history about that, so we can talk about it, the oral history of this getting to Palestine. There are a lot of people who are going to Palestine, but at this point, in the age of pandemic, the only way we can communicate with each other is online. So I wanted to mention two things. One is the start with that, which is also the very problematic notion that everybody is using Zoom, and we know that people have to use something to communicate with each other. But this is also part of the solidarity, that at the very least, if people are using this, they should not make it business as usual. It should not be normalized. There is something wrong with a tech giant that actually has a veto power over the content of our classrooms and the content of what we say and so on, and they should be held accountable. So that's a very big statement that people really need to be supportive of us on. This is why we're on this platform, okay? And that Zoom developed itself, other people can develop itself. Secondly, I wanted to also bring up the question. In addition, I agree with Sam, but also one of the issues that are actually we're facing us now is the whole question within critical ethnic studies. So critical ethnic studies has been seen as a property of people of color, and four groups of people of color: indigenous, black, Asian, and Latinos, okay? And so now there is a very big Zionist attack to undermine the way we teach, the critical nature of the way we teach ethnic studies, and also to expel Palestine, Arab, Muslim studies from it. I mean, this is a huge, huge battle. And I think this is something that we really need to talk about. And I think this whole discussion that we're having now and coming together and building the knowledge base, as we are, the whole education, we're all educators, to actually think about that in a very meaningful way, in a way that actually impacts where we're at and how do we do our learning and so on, and try to address all of these questions and so on. Obviously, the conversation is not finished. There is so much to do, but it's just a question of kind of like thinking about there's some things that people need to do something about right now, and connections and so on, and then other things actually kind of like we already talked about doing something really major for May 19th, which is the birthday of Malcolm X and the passing of Ilan Bebrat. We were supposed to have a whole honoring of Ilan Bebrat on his birthday at the end of September, but due to the cancellation of our webinar and the attacks against us and so on, we just simply, and we couldn't even find another platform at the time. So we had simply, we couldn't even do it. It was supposed to be also the 50th anniversary of the passing of Jamal Abdel Nasser, to talk about 1970, to link it to the statement. Mm-hmm. We had to, I mean, this is how these attacks actually basically silence us. We rise, we're doing this is really great. So this is the question of kind of like, what do we do? How do we go? Where do we go from here?
Excellent points, and thank you for. I'm learning about StreamYard. I never knew anything, so just grateful for that experience. And as we talk to our friends in Cuba, we find the same thing, that they're not able to use Zoom. So I think that that's a really critically important point that you're making, Dr. Abdul Hadid, and we all need to be thinking, expanding our knowledge base. Did Phil or the ambassador, anybody else want to come in and talk about connecting this 1970 statement to the future? Any thoughts on how we learn from this intergenerational conversation that we're having?
Well, I'll be brief. I like what Sam said, and thinking about the possibility of updating it to the 21st century, and how we would go about doing that.
Mm-hmm. Good points. Well,
Robert is speaking, but he's muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you muted?
Yeah, now he's on.
I guess.
There you are.
Was I muted? Okay. One thing that I think it's very important to remember is not to let the enemy define us, because they will try to tell us that what we're about is something new and unprecedented. Not true. We are part of a continuum. Our struggle has for a long time been very international and had very, very many examples of solidarity put into practice and not just theory. And, when the United States established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and it was the United States that did that. When they sort of twisted arms and got recognition from 3 countries in the Arab world for Israel and good relations. Well, actually, only 2 recognized Israel formally. The third one has decided to normalize commercial relations with Israel. This is not something new. Very little was actually changed in the Middle East as a result of these actions. But we've got to remember and bear in mind the history upon which all of what we do is built, what was built. So I just don't think that it's wise for us to let them get away with saying that this is unprecedented. And what we do with the Palestinians is not unprecedented. It's perfectly natural and normal and should be encouraged as something that is normal and that does have precedent. So don't let them put us in a little box and say that for us to think about Palestine is unusual somehow. It's not unusual. It's perfectly normal.
Wow. Well, I think those were all
Beg your
excellent statements, it's been an honor to really, like I say, to be here and to have learned. I want to just thank Dr. Professor Abdul Hadi. What a wonderful collection of people and information that you've brought together, and of course all of the panelists, Sam Anderson and Phil Hutchinson and Ambassador Van Leer, who I'm so sorry that we weren't able to hear from Fran Beal, but appreciated what you had to say, Professor, in terms of just sharing some of her comments. I know that. What was that?
Gave us her
She gave us your
proxy.
proxy. There you go. And well, you all
She gave us
really
her proxy.
tied her in really important ways. So thank you all for representing her.
Do we have any idea how many people were watching this?
That's where we have to ask maybe Salim or.
Yeah, so it fluctuated to 50 people. Right now, 34 people are currently watching. So hello to
on the StreamYard, right, Salim? On the StreamYard.
Yeah, just on StreamYard. But if folks like shared it beyond that, and it's going to be preserved online, so people will watch it. It'll have an afterlife of its own.
And just to say, I want to also just again thank Eyewitness Palestine. That was Omar from Eyewitness Palestine question, and National Students for Justice in Palestine, because they both gave us the platforms on Facebook as well as YouTube to be able to carry it, because YouTube continues to block us, but they actually basically gave us a live say, yeah, we're blocked by YouTube over the webinar. We were blocked by YouTube, by Facebook, and by Zoom. And unfortunately, the university did not do anything to actually challenge them to not allow, not to. But anyway, they actually made it possible for us. So this is now live on Facebook and live on YouTube, and there is multiple platforms on Facebook, multiple of our co-sponsors that Anais mentioned that also carry it. So we expect, when we did the Black Liberation on July 21st, I think we started with 500. Now we have over 9,500 views. So
that's a great.
I think people will watch. I think people will learn. I think this is.
It's important. And I just want to point to the evaluation form, the link to the evaluation form that are in the various chat boxes on the screen. And they've been posted no matter which platform you've used. So I'm sure it'll be really important to get feedback from all who are able to attend. And it'll be very helpful for the organizers as we consider future programs. I'm saying we. Do you see how I've just jumped in? I've learned so much and really appreciated just this opportunity to be with you all, and just grateful for what I've been able to learn. So thank you everybody. And
I'm glad that we got Phil. I hope he gets to feel better soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And can I just say one more thing?
Sure, absolutely.
The elections are Tuesday on November 3rd. I want to say, no matter what happens, November 4th, we wake up and we continue organizing, we continue struggling, we continue until all of us are free.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I won't be able to, unfortunately, because I volunteered to help Mr. Chump move out of the White House. So I'll be busy.
But that's not until January.
Helping to load up his truck.
You said you'll be busy, huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Well,
Peace.
thank you again,
Okay.
everyone. And look forward until the next time.
Okay.
All right. Goodbye.